the Indian medical system that comes from the Vedas, which is the same source of the meditative practices of yoga. So they're often considered sister sciences. They go hand in hand. So the yoga path led me to the Ayurveda path, and then Ayurveda sort of tipped me over into herbs, and that's been my newer frontier. So I'm excited to be here with you all, and hopefully I'll learn something as well as teaching something. So you can go ahead and dive right in. Was there anything else we needed to go into? You good to go?
Yeah, just in general, folks will do anatomy and physiology for the first 2 hours or so. Obviously, if you need to get up and use the restroom, do what you need to do. This is being recorded. And we're going to take a break after 2 hours, a 10-minute break to turn your camera off and walk away. And then we'll come back and talk about herbs and tissue states. And then we'll talk a little bit about vinegar infusions. So you'll get like a good break there in the middle. But if there comes a point where it feels like too much, like you can take your own break, or you can also kind of raise your hand and say like, hey, can we all take a break, because I want to be engaged but I'm not right now. The Zoom stuff is hard. I've been doing a lot of Zooming. You probably have been doing a lot of Zooming too. So let's find ways to support each other and being engaged. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks so much for having me here today, Lacey.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to talk about Ayurveda in general. I'm going to try to sort of skip through the foundational topics in a concise way. Normally I would take 5 hours to do an intro to Ayurveda, and we're going to try to smoosh that into 1 hour so we have time to talk about Ayurveda's understanding of the bone tissue and the muscle and all of the tissues as well. So I'll just dive right into an intro to Ayurveda. And yeah, Lacey, we can go ahead and pop up that first slide with the elements on it if you haven't. Lacey made this beautiful slide presentation, which is way beyond my capacity, and it's beautiful, so thank you. All right, so we'll go right into the 5 elements slide here. Great. So one of the things I'm passionate about is the way that ancient people understood the human body and the world around them, and often it was sort of microcosm, macrocosm, that it was the same thing happening outside as within, and almost all of them come up with some system of elements. And every culture's elements are a little bit different, so studying the elements is something I'm really passionate about. Here in Ayurveda, we have 5 elements. Some of them are familiar to us. Fire, water, earth, and air are all the Western, the Greek elements. And we also have ether here. So the thing to understand about the elements is that they do represent, you could think of them as sort of spirit or a personality or a type of movement, whether that's emotion, but also physical movement in the body or physical processes in the body. But they also represent a collection of different qualities. So the word in I'm going to use a lot of Sanskrit. The Western scientific language is Latin. The Ayurvedic scientific language is Sanskrit. So I'll try to always translate, but there's a lot of Sanskrit embedded here. So the word is gunas, G-U-N-A, and it means qualities. And so these are simple pairs of opposites or a spectrum of a certain quality, like heat versus cool as the spectrum of temperature, heavy versus light, and so on and so on. So each of these elements is going to represent sort of a little collection of qualities as well as a certain type of process. So I just want to briefly touch on each of them. The first one is actually ether, which we have this beautiful purple swirl here, like outer space. Ether in Ayurveda represents 3-dimensional space. So it's not the air that's in the space, it's the actual, a mathematician took one of my classes and called it the 0-point field. So if that makes sense for you guys, but it's the actual dimensions that we inhabit. You can also think of outer space and the enormous distances, the amount of space between objects, as the ether element. So ether element we see in our bodies as the different anatomical spaces, like the cranial space, the chest cavity, the pelvic bowl as well, and the size and the shape of the bones, their structures, their length, how much distance a femur can cross. So the ether is going to be really relevant to bone tissue and just to the way that the human body takes its unique form, the way that it looks and takes up space. So that's the ether. The second element is going to be air, with these little gray swirls. And when you think of air, I encourage you to think of wind more than air. So air we can often think of as like this stuff, these little molecules in the space around us. That is accurate, however, to get the personality and the qualities of it remembered well in your brain, you want to think of the wind whipping past a mountaintop in the winter. So air is going to represent cold, and it's dry, very dry. It's rough. And so it's going to create those qualities within us. We're going to get dry nails, dry, chapped lips. We're going to have rough skin. We're going to get very cold in our extremities. So these are the qualities of air, according to Ayurveda, very different than the Western sanguine type of air. This again is going to be extraordinarily relevant to bone tissue. Dryness is an issue with bone, and we'll get into that later in class as well. The other important thing to know about air is that it represents movement. So anywhere that there's movement in the body, there is air present. So that's just walking around through space, that's blinking your eyelashes, the beating of your heart, your pulse is considered air element, even though the blood is fire element. So there's overlapping, all of these concepts are going to dance together a little bit. So moving on to fire, I feel like I'm going at light speed here, but we're moving on to fire. Fire is going to be the temperature in your body and the heat principle. It's also going to be form as far as the light hitting our eyes and our ability to understand the shapes of things around us. So the light principle and color as well. So things in the body that create color, flushing, redness, yellow substances in the body. These are all going to be functions of the fire element. So you can probably hear in there that the liver is going to be involved with fire, the skin will be involved, the eyes. And we'll touch on these briefly, but not quite as much. We'll be spending more of our thought process around air today than fire. And just to finish up here, we've got water and earth. Water is the next element. This is going to be all the lubricating principles in the body, all of the fluids in the body. And then earth is going to be all of the hard structures in the body. So water, its qualities are soft, cool, smooth. The earth qualities are going to be hard and dry and cold and rough. So you can see some similarities in the earth and the air element in some of the qualities they bring forward: cold, dry, rough. The difference is that earth element is very stable and it creates form and structure, whereas the air element is very erratic and it creates movement and variety. So those are the two qualities, or excuse me, the elements that we're really going to focus on with the bone tissue today. I'm good to go on to the next slide, if you guys are all good with that information so far. Okay, so once we have an idea, a familiarity of the personality of these different elements and the qualities that they create in the body, then we can start kind of playing alchemy and creating different things out of these elements. So one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit towards the end is that the 6 tastes of Ayurveda, spicy, sour, salty, they're all different combinations of elements as well. But here, this is sort of the main hallmark of Ayurveda, the 3 dosha system. It doesn't really translate very well. You can think of the 4 humors of the European medieval model, the melancholic, phlegmatic, sanguine, if you're familiar with those. That's kind of the closest we can get to it as a translation. Dosha is a word that means at fault. So these 3 humors of the body, these 3 energies of the body, are what cause disease when they are in excess. When you have too much of something, it's going to create an imbalance, and that will create symptoms. And if you don't listen to the symptoms and correct the imbalance, it ultimately can accumulate into disease because you have too much accumulation of qualities. So let's look at Vata, the first one. You've got space, that's the ether, and air, which is like wind. So wind and space are coming together to create vata. That's a lot of cold, dry, distant, lots of separation, lots of subtlety. And so if we get too much vata accumulated in our body, the body will become, it'll wither a little bit, it'll get a little smaller, it'll get a little weaker, it'll get colder, rough, it won't be as well lubricated, it won't digest as well because it's too cold, it doesn't have that metabolic fire. So it'll sort of shrivel. And this is what we see happening in extreme old age. Vata is the last stage of the life cycle before transition into death. And so vata is something we really all need to watch really closely to make sure we're not over accumulating those dry, rough qualities. There's too much wind in the body. Also, because air is associated with movement, with vata, we have a connection to the nervous system. So frayed nerves, erratic movement, twitching, or unsteadiness, lightheadedness, nervousness, these are all excess vata symptoms as well. And these are all ways that your body can say, I have way too much air and space, you really need to balance me out and bring some of those other elements into your diet. How do you bring elements into your diet? That'll be answered with the 6 tastes. And we go, okay, well, which tastes are created by air and space? Maybe I need to dial back those tastes a little bit and emphasize some of the other ones in my diet. So again, this is all super quick shorthand for things. Please feel free to stop me if any of this is not making sense. Okay, so the next humor that we have here is the Pitta dosha. And Pitta is a combination of fire and water. So you can think of this as all of the hot, acidic fluids in your body. Generally, it's in the gut. It's the bile secretions from the digestive system and the liver. It's the hormones are going to be Pitta as well, stomach acid, enzymes, all of these things that help digest or metabolize are going to be Pitta dosha in the body. Over accumulation of this is going to give us things like reflux and stomach ulcers and redness and agitation, inflammation, headaches. Our eyes get really red and intense, aggression, anger, frustration. So just overheated and over agitated in the tissues when we have too much of that Pitta dosha. And I won't spend too much time on Pitta because it's not relevant to bone, but we'll move, it is, but not as much as Vata. And we'll move over to Kapha for the last one. So Kapha is the 3rd dosha. It's a combination of water and earth elements. So you can think of this as mud or clay. So a shamanic term for the body is the clay body. So it's this physical form that we live in. So Kapha is really going to rule a lot of the musculoskeletal tissues that we're going to talk about today, because it has to do with structure and stability, like making a clay pot. Almost all cultures have some sort of myth of humans being formed out of clay, out of mud. So our bodies are made out of these water and earth elements. When you have too much of those water and earth elements, you're going to overaccumulate. You're going to be too bound in the physical body. You might have growths or funguses or cysts or clogged veins, blockages, just too much goop and accumulation of stuff and heaviness in the body. And there won't be that lightness and life force that is needed. It even can clog up the sinuses and prevent you from being able to breathe well. So Kapha is going to create stagnation and blockage when we have too much of it. So these 3 forces, they're sort of like the 3 stooges. They kind of bump into each other, and these 2 try to balance, and then this one knocks them over. And it's kind of this like comedy of errors where they're all running into each other and causing problems. They're constantly in flux. Vata is the winter time and the fall. Pitta is the summertime. Kapha is the spring. They also fluctuate throughout the day. Vata is going to be super early morning and afternoon. Pitta is going to be midnight and midday. Kapha is going to be morning time, late morning, and early evening time, around dinner time. So they're constantly fluctuating during the day. They're fluctuating during your year. They're fluctuating during your lifetime. Kapha is going to be childhood up to You could argue puberty, you could argue age 30 or so when the bones are finished growing, because kapha is anabolic. It has to do with growth and creating foundation and structure. Pitta is going to be the middle of the life, from either puberty or 30 years old, depending, up into about menopause age. So it's that middle of life where you are transforming, you're evolving. There's this sort of light and this leadership quality that comes forward in that time. It's the creative, fertile time of life as well. And then vata will be from this menopause time to the end of life. And this is the time where you have really the most subtle wisdom. Vata is very subtle. So there's a lot of wisdom, there's a lot of perspective that you get in that phase of life. It's also a time to sort of withdraw from the hubbub of the pitta world and retreat a little into some more spiritual practices, some more subtle practices to cultivate the part of you that is not a physical body. So you're cultivating those subtle parts of who you are. So that's how it moves throughout your life cycle. And of course, we see the dryness coming in old age as well, and the thinning of the tissues, which is vata as well. In addition, you can be born with more of one and less of another. And most of us have two doshas that are pretty dominant, and the third one is not as much. It can also happen that you have mostly just one of these doshas as your natural who you are. So when we talk about balancing the doshas, we don't want 33% of each of them in our bodies. We want a proportion that reflects the unique cocktail of who you are. So some people just have a more metabolic body type. They're just more fiery. Things, they eat food and it flies through their digestive system faster. They get hot easier, they sweat easier. They just naturally have more fire. And let's say they're 70% pitta and 20% kapha and 10% vata. If we were to try to arrange their diet to make them 30% of each, that would be way too much kapha and way too much vata, and they're going to feel cold and dull and stagnant and maybe a little weak, and they're just not going to feel like themselves, and they won't be healthy. So the word in Ayurveda for health is svasta, and it means to be established in yourself. So you are healthy when your current doshas, whatever's going on in you today in this moment, match your DNA blueprint of what your doshas were as you were being born. So when you're established in yourself, that's when you're healthy. So when we talk about these qualities, dryness, heat, heaviness, etc., what's heavy for me might feel very light to you, or what's cold for you might actually feel really comfortable to me, because we all have our unique chemical makeup. And so that's kind of the beauty of the dosha system, is that it allows for individualized medicine. And so then when you're offering herbs to people to help them, you want to look at their unique body and then look at the doshic makeup of the herb that you're using. Like cayenne, that's a pretty pitta herb, as opposed to mugwort is a pretty vata herb. So we're going to look at the personality and the dosha makeup of the herb, and then have the herb and the body of the client talk to each other and create a sort of balance that way. So is this all landing okay with everyone so far? Any questions at this point? Okay. Then I think we can move on to the next slide. Great. So this is a fabulous photo of all of the tissue cycle of Ayurveda. So you'll see the Sanskrit words there. We're going to start at the direction that this person is looking with rasa, plasma. It's also lymph. Plasma and lymph are rasa. And we're going to work our way sort of counterclockwise around the circle. So everything in Ayurveda really has to do with digestion. The digestive capacity, the metabolic capacity of the body is called Agni, A-G-N-I, Agni. And it is just the fire element. So Pitta was the fire and water together. When we take just the fire concept by itself, then we get metabolic function in the body isolated from the dosha. So your efficiency at getting nutrition out of your food and into your lymph and your plasma is going to be what determines the quality of the tissues that you build in your body. So a lot of Western diet culture will say things like, speed up your metabolism, it has to go faster, faster. That's actually not necessarily what we're looking for in Ayurveda. Ayurveda would say, if your food is flying through your metabolism too quickly, you're not going to have the time that you need to really extract the nutrients from all of that food. So we don't necessarily want fast metabolism, we want efficient metabolism. We want a digestive system that's really good at getting the nutrition out of the food. This is also why Ayurveda prefers not to use vitamins or supplements when we can avoid it. Taking vitamin K or B or whatever it is. We prefer to encourage people to get their vitamin content from herbs and from food, because the Agni, the digestion, is often not robust enough to assimilate that entire horse pill of vitamin, and usually it just comes right back out through the urine or through some other part of the body, where you can't really assimilate it. It either gets stored or it gets released, and you only get a little bit of it. We would rather your body talk to the intelligence of the plant and all of its supporting chemicals that are going to really help your system to assimilate that nourishment into you. And I should clarify, when I'm talking about Agni, I don't just mean your belly digestion and your they would call it Jatar Agni, the great Agni, which is from the mouth and then out through the waste products and that whole system through all those organs. I'm also talking about the subtle Agni. For example, cellular metabolism is part of your Agni. So if your digestion is having some trouble or having a lot of trouble, you can bet that your cellular metabolism is not going to be as robust either. And another element of Agni that's relevant to today's conversation is that every tissue of the body, all of these 7 tissues, which I will talk through in a moment as soon as I complete my thought, each one of these tissues has its own Agni, has its own digestive capacity. So your muscles have a metabolic capacity, your bone has a metabolic capacity, your fat has a metabolic capacity, and all of these could be quite robust and healthy, or they could be compromised in one way or the other. And what's interesting in this Ayurvedic concept is that the tissues metabolize or transform into one another. So they create each other as you go around the cycle. So we're starting with food, comes in the mouth to the belly, and it turns into what Ayurveda would call ahara rasa. Basically, I think the Western word is chyle, C-H-Y-L-E, but it turns into this blob of nutrition. And the first place it goes is to the lymph and the plasma, which are grouped together as rasa dhatu. Dhatu is the word for tissue that you see there at the top, 7 dhatus. So it turns into rasa dhatu. This is your lymph and your plasma. It takes about 5 days, according to Ayurveda, for a change of your intake of qualities. Say you're eating a lot of really hot, spicy foods and you decide, no, I'm going to change my diet, and you decide to take all of those out. It's going to take 5 days of not eating those spicy foods until we can see the quality of coolness start to show up in your lymph and your plasma. So it'll take a little while, but not too long. Within the week of that dietary change, you can look at the lymph and plasma and go, its qualities have changed. It has started to take on the qualities of this new food that's coming in. So that's the first stop along this tissue cycle, is the lymph and plasma. It's also the first place we want to look we want to get the disease, quote, while it's still whispering, before it starts screaming at you that there's a problem. So lymphatic movement with self-massage is really popular in Ayurveda, joint rolling to get the lymph moving in the ankles, that sort of thing. Really helpful for flushing out potential disease while it's still in its infancy. So lymph is a really helpful place to start working. And then we transform down into blood. So it takes about 10 days for that dietary change or that lifestyle change to start affecting the qualities of the blood. So Ayurveda says that the mature lymph tissue, as the immature lymph tissue is being transformed into mature lymph tissue, as it's being created, it's also creating at the same time immature blood tissue, or cells, we could say. So then the blood tissue, as it's maturing into fully formed blood tissue, it's also creating immature muscle tissue. And this is sort of how they dovetail into each other the whole way around. So the quality of your lymph is also going to determine the quality of your immature blood cells that are then going to become mature blood cells. So this sort of waterfalls, the qualities will waterfall their way through the tissues. So after 10 days of this change, we can see the qualities start to change the blood tissue. Blood is the only tissue that is ruled by Pitta dosha, the fire body. So blood has a connection specifically to the summertime and to the Pitta people and the Pitta time of life. Then we'll see the blood, quality of the blood and the amount of nutrition in the blood. This is going to determine the quality of the muscle tissue. So the blood perfusion through the muscle tissue, this is going to develop the strength and the integrity of the muscle tissue. So again, every time we're going through a different tissue, it has to have a good metabolic capacity to create the next tissue in the cycle. Now, when we get to muscle tissue, a lot of the things that, at least in the yoga world, get grouped into bone and stuff, connective tissue, bone and fascia and ligaments and tendons. A lot of those things are actually considered muscle tissue. So the tissues are creating themselves, they're creating the next tissue in line, and they're also going to create a waste product and a superior byproduct. And all this creation, and every time I say create, that's a metabolic function, to create something, to transform one thing into another thing. So when we're looking at fascia and tendons and these connections, these are going to be a superior byproduct of muscle tissue. And the muscle, of course, is also going to have its waste products that'll be cleansed out of the body as well. Just to give you an example, to jump ahead for a moment, in the female reproductive system, menstrual blood is going to be the waste product. Breast milk is going to be the superior byproduct. So every system, every tissue system is going to have a waste product, it's going to have a superior byproduct. All right, so let's move on till we get to the bone here. So the muscle's going to feed into the fat tissue. So again, we don't want to only focus on how much fat tissue there is, but we also want to focus on the quality of the fat tissue. And fat isn't just, water balloons we're carrying around. It's alive, it's producing hormone, it's doing things, it's lubricating the bones, it's lubricating the joints. So it's an important tissue that we need to respect and have gratitude for in our bodies. And the fat tissue then is going to create the immature bone tissue. So if you don't have good fat, if you don't have enough of it, if you have way too much of it, or if it's not functioning properly in some way, then you won't have good bones. You need good fat to have good bones. So the bone tissue is formed out of the fat tissue. And bone tissue is the only dhatu, the only tissue that is ruled by vata dosha, by that air and ether, or the wind and space elements that I mentioned earlier. And hopefully we'll have a lot of time to talk about bone tissue, but here's where it is in the cycle. So if you remember, I mentioned 5 days to get to plasma, 10 days to get to blood. It takes 15 days to see a change in the muscle tissue, 20 days in the fat tissue. And here we have, it takes 25 days for the bone to see a significant change. So it's a pretty slow moving tissue. The word asti in Sanskrit, it has the same root as steady, established, stable structure. All those countries that end with istan, like Pakistan, it's that st, S-T-H root word that means established. So the bones are creating the structure for the body. They also allow for the movement of the body. If you didn't have bones, you couldn't get up and walk across the room. So vata is creating the movement, is represented in the movement of the bone, but also there's some earth element here too, because it's stable and established. So we'll talk a little bit more about bone throughout, but let's finish up this 7 dhatu cycle. So the quality of the bone 5 days later is going to affect the quality of what's called maja dhatu. Now they have nerve written here, but it's also marrow. So the marrow is considered a different tissue from the bone. And the marrow, just like most of the tissues, is ruled by kapha, the water and earth, the clay, the soft, steady tissue. And then from the nerve and marrow tissue, the final dhatu that's formed is the reproductive tissue. The word they have here, shukra, it's usually used as the category term, but it also is specific for the male reproductive system, which is why they have a little sperm here. The word for the female reproductive tissue is artava, which is A-R-T-A-V-A, artava dhatu. So they do have different names, and we can think of this certainly as the reproductive fluid, certainly as the reproductive organs, but also as the DNA. So all of this is happening at a cellular level as well as a more gross level, a more obvious level. Finally, see this really like exciting lightning bolt graphic here going from that into the heart. So the metaphor here in the image is talking about something called ojas. So ojas is the final thing that is produced after this 40-day cycle. So it was 35 days to see a change in reproductive tissue. And we can see that if you're working with clients who have a menstrual issue, it's going to take at least one cycle or probably more before you see a change in the qualities they're experiencing, too much heat, too much dryness, et cetera, et cetera. So finally, 40 days in, we see a development of something called ojas. It's spelled O-J-A-S, ojas. Ojas is basically the immune system. This is considered a sort of a superfine byproduct, the final product of food. And it's your ability to buffer yourself from all the sort of slings and arrows of life. So it's your resiliency, it's your vitality. And they do talk about it chemically as existing in every single cell. So let me see if I can pull up. I know Western chemistry is not really part of this, but I want to see if I can pull up the word that they've used for it. So it's talking about ojas. This is Dr. Ladd's book, by the way, which is a reference that I used for this talk. Dr. Ladd is the man who brought Ayurveda to America in the 80s, and he has some really lovely texts, and they swing wildly from chemistry to spirituality and back and forth. So it's really a wild roller coaster to read. But he's talking about ojas specifically as a protoplasmic biological substance that includes albumin, globulin, and many other hormones formed during the biosynthesis of bodily tissue. So if you needed a slightly more Western sounding version of that, that's what it is. It's the globulin and the albumin and so on, basically as produced by the liver. And the reason that this little arrow is going into the heart is that Ayurveda would say that the heart is the repository of the most superfine, refined ojas in the entire system, that it lives at the heart. So again, Ayurveda really gets to this point where there is no line between the physical chemistry and the spiritual reality. So things are very in flux, especially when you get into those tiny little, smaller than the cells sort of entities that live in the body, like ojas. So this is the Datu cycle. This is how things start as food and they slowly work their way the whole way through to create our immune system. So this is why whenever there's a change in diet, whenever there's perhaps an herb prescribed to someone or a lifestyle change, sleeping patterns, exercise, that sort of thing, we always recommend 40 days. Usually people will say 4 to 6 weeks, but really it's so that it's long enough that this new quality that you're introducing into your body has time to permeate the whole way down to your most fine, refined tissues in the entire body. So that is the Datu cycle. Is this feeling okay? Anybody have any pressing questions about this? Okay, so I don't think we have a slide for this next concept, so I'll just sort of explain it while we're here. So I've talked about Ojas as the immune system. And we talked about how the doshas, the 3 doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, they cause disease when they overaccumulate. What we want to do with our doshas is not necessarily eliminate them, because they do create bodily systems. So the lung tissue and the mucus, this is all the kapha, and we don't want to strip too much of that out of our body, because then our bronchial tubes will be way too vulnerable to whatever's out there. Same with the belly. We don't want to get rid of all of our bile, because then we won't be able to process food. And Vata lives down in the colon and it's formed as gas in the body. We don't want to get rid of all of our gases and all of our air pockets and porousness in the body, because then there won't be any ability to move things through peristalsis and remove waste. So we do need the doshas. However, when they overaccumulate, what we want to do is digest them or transform them into their more refined versions of themselves. So Ojas, the immune system, is the refined version of Kapha, the water element in the body. So you can think of, for example, herbs that are very demulcent, that have a lot of mucilage. Those are herbs that have a lot of Kapha element in them. And we take them so that they create sort of a protective coating that's going to make us more resilient. And that's the Ojas quality. If we took way too much of that quality of sticky goopiness, we would get an overaccumulation of kapha with lots of mucus and congestion, because it was too much for our body to process into ojas. Again, there's that agni coming in, that digestive capacity. So we only want to take in as much as we can process into the refined version of the dosha. If we just take in too much of that raw, unprocessed quality from our food, then the body doesn't have anywhere to go with it, and it overaccumulates and causes disease. So the other 2 doshas have equivalents as well. Pitta's equivalent is something called tejas, which is basically radiance of the mind and this sort of vim and vigor and courage and intelligence. And the Vata's refined quality is prana, which is Ayurveda's version of chi, like in the Chinese system. It is the life force. So if we take in too much dry, rough, cold stuff, like too many salads, too many uncooked raw foods, this is going to create too much Vata, and we'll get dry and anxious and gassy and nervous, and we'll have too much Vata rolling around. But if we have the right amount of those bitter, light foods, it actually is going to invigorate us and create more life force and more prana within the body, because it was the right amount for our digestion, our agni, to be able to transform into life force. So absolutely everything has to do with what is your capacity to process this, to digest this. Obviously, this happens on the physical level, but also is happening in the mind. You know, what impressions are you taking in? What kind of relationships do you have? What sort of music are you listening to? What sort of essential oils are you rubbing on your body all the time? And what is your liver's capacity? What is your mind's capacity? What is your stomach's capacity to actually get some nutrition out of that and release what's not needed? Okay, so those were the subtle doshas, ojas, tejas, and prana, and we always want more of those. And the sort of final thought on those concepts is that ojas, the refined form of kapha, the immune system, our vitality, our protection, ojas, And vata, the dosha of air, of wind, the dosha of catabolism, of decay, they are inverse proportionate. They're opposites. Another way to say this is the nervous system and the immune system are on a seesaw. So the more agitated and nervous we get, the more the immune system is going to plummet. The stronger our immune system is, the calmer our nervous system will be. So these are sort of seesawing back and forth. The refined form of kapha and the raw form of vata, they kind of cancel each other out. Since bone tissue is ruled by vata, we absolutely need to work on building our ojas, on building our refined kapha, our good quality immune function, in order to keep our bones from getting too dried out, too thin, too fragile. So this is something to really keep in mind, and I'll try to hit this again later. I know it's a lot of terminology to digest at once, but that's the basic idea, is we're going to need more ojas if we want to build strong bones. How is that feeling for the moment? Everybody, any questions? Everybody okay? Okay. So let's see, what is our next slide? So now we've got some really great pictures of bones. So we can look through some of those slides and check out some cross sections of bones. Great, so here, let me see where they have it labeled. There, the periosteum. So if you guys look down where that little red vein is, there's sort of a thin layer that they've drawn being peeled off of the bone that says periosteum. So that's something that's pretty important when we talk about bone tissue in Ayurveda. And you'll see that the marrow, there is the yellow marrow there, that's considered a separate tissue. So when we're talking about bones, we actually do want to think of them as hollow, even though we know that there's marrow inside. The marrow is considered a different thing. So the bone itself is going to be porous and hollow, and that's why that air is coming in. So I'm going to talk, we can hang out on this slide for a while. I'm going to talk through how Ayurveda thinks about bone tissue specifically. So as I mentioned before, the bone tissue is called asti, which has to do with the STH word, the stable, steady, established. So we want that form and structure. The people who have the most form and structure and stability in their bodies are people who were born with a lot of kapha dosha by nature. So people who have that steadiness, they're going to have stronger bones. So there's a certain body type, sort of an endomorph body type that goes along with kapha, and it includes sturdy, strong bones. Kapha is the strongest of the doshas. Pitta has this sort of Goldilocks thing going where it's not too much of that, not too much of that. It's just right. So it's just kind of in the middle. And then vata, people who are born with a lot of vata, or people in their vata phase of life, or people with some sort of vata disorder, their vata is going to be so overaccumulated that it's going to start to affect its own tissue, which is the bone tissue. And the bones are going to get extra air in them. They're going to be too porous. They're going to be too dry and fragile. And they're going to be much easier to break or to have some sort of issue going on with their digestive capacity, with the bone metabolism. So everyone's bones, according to Ayurveda, are made up of about 80% of the earth element. So those were the qualities of hard, cold, dry, stable. Earth element, and about 15% air element. And the air was the unsteady, erratic, rough, cold, and dry. They're made up of about 5% water element. And that water element lives in the periosteum, which we took a look at earlier. So let's think about just the air element for a moment. The air element, its movement, including vibration, So vibration is really relevant to bone tissue. This is the only vata tissue. It sort of is the poster child for vata. Um, so vibration is sound. Sound is a type of vibration. And the sounds that we hear, they're rattling around these three little bones in our ears. And when we speak, we hear our own sound through our own bones. So the bones are sort of antenna for sound and vibration. And so this is where the air element comes into the bones, that they're sort of like crystals. They're these vibratory living tissue within us, and they respond to sound. One of the things we talk about a lot in yoga, or at least in Ayurvedic style of yoga, is to hum or make some gentle sound while you're in a pose, because that's going to vibrate and awaken the metabolic function of the bone. We want to awaken the Agni, the metabolism of the bone, so that the bone will keep putting down good layers of well-formed, mature bone tissue, and so it'll give us good raw material to create marrow next, to give us immature marrow tissue. So the sound, it also is going to soothe the nervous system. So these bones are the sort of antennas or the tent poles for the nervous system. And when we can feel through vibration, when we can feel where our bones are, it really soothes the nervous system. The nervous system goes down, the ojas, the immune system, goes up, and that's going to help us, again, to become a little stronger, a little more resilient. So sound is an excellent therapy for bones. It's that vibration that's rattling through the bones. And as I mentioned, the air element is what makes the bones move through space. We often think of bones as like just rocks, you know, just these sort of like dead tissue in here, but it's a living tissue. And so we can stimulate it through movement, through sound, through the steady tug of gravity, and we will create more bone tissue. We can cultivate a little bit more bone density through those behaviors. So it's not just, you know, these are a bunch of planks of dead wood in your body and that's it. It's a living tissue that we can interact with, and we can feel bone tissue. As yoga practitioners, people are so used to feeling their muscles. They know what it feels like to feel the burn and contract a muscle. They know what it feels like to like stretch and feel that tug. So it's all muscle, 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 muscle. And they very rarely think about, how do my bones feel? What does it feel like when my bone tissue is stimulated? So Ayurvedic styles of yoga involve bearing weight on the bones in a way that relaxes the muscles away, and we're just pushing on the bone tissue. Hopefully I'll have a moment to talk about yin yoga at some point once I get through the bone tissue here, and I can revisit that concept for you. But so the air element is going to help us with the sound. It's going to help us with the movement of bone tissue. It's also what creates the porosity of bone tissue, is that air, the pockets of air, porousness in the bone, and the hollowness. Coming down to the earth element, that accounts for 80% of the bone tissue. Again, earth element, it is kapha, but it is dry, which is different than the watery kapha dosha that we talked about earlier. So this is hard and dry. So this gives them their solidity. The earth element accounts for the minerals that are stored in the bone, the metals that are stored in the bone, iron, copper, zinc, salts. It accounts for the stability of the bone. The bone also is offering the framework that all the connective tissues are pulling off of. So here's where maybe we could take a look at a joint, moving ahead a couple slides to take, if we could please, to take a glance at a joint. Thank you. So bone is connective tissue. Bone, you know, it's the knee bone's connected to the ankle bone, right? So the bone itself is a form of connective tissue, but then when it interfaces with each other, bones interface with each other, we've got a joint, or when the bone interfaces with the muscle, then we've got what we often call connective tissues, tendons and ligaments. And then the fascia is really more an intramuscular connective tissue that's surrounding each of the muscle fibers. So here we've got our little joint, and we can see that the synovial fluid, which is a form of kapha, a form of water in the body, is needed to cushion where these two bones come together. So the bone does not have enough water element to interface directly with itself. It needs these additional pockets of kapha throughout the body. This is why moving the joints, moving the bones is good for the lymph. The lymph is a fluid, it's ruled by kapha. We need to stir it up and clear it out. And so we take these dry bones like a spoon in a cauldron and we churn our joints. And that helps to move and clear out the lymph tissue. So the hard, dry bone can really be used to balance the wet of the synovial fluid. So here's where these are coming together. You'll often see the body does that. For example, kapha lives up in the lungs, which is where all this air is coming in and out. It's because the dryness of the air needs to be balanced by the wetness of the lungs. So we're seeing these interfaces happen between the elements throughout the body. So the bones are creating the structure that the ligaments are holding onto. So they need stability. We need to have the bones really have a lot of earth so that they can hold their own. And I like to picture the masts on an old ship. And you've got these tall masts. And then the ligaments are sort of all these ropes and pulleys that are attached to the masts, and everything's in conversation with each other. And you tighten this one and this one slackens, and you tighten that one and this one slackens. So that's what's happening with all the connective tissues. And when we're moving around, whether in a yoga class or just moving around in life, you know, moving the bone a certain way, all of that connective tissue has to compensate so that the bone can get where it needs to go. So they're sort of in conversation with each other. Practices like yin yoga, they allow a lot of stillness, and the connective tissues need stillness to reorient. Muscle moves fast, fast and hot. Bone is cold and slow. And so the ligaments and the tendons have to balance between those two. That's the elemental interface between those two, fiery and air qualities. So when we're holding steady for a long period of time, it gives the ligaments time to come back to homeostasis. So if they're overstretched, they will shorten up over time. If they're too compact, they will lengthen over time. We just have to have more of a bone consciousness rather than a muscle consciousness, rather than, you know, when you see runners kind of like stretching and bouncing and, you know, at the end of their run and kind of like pulsing and trying to push into a stretch, that's a muscle consciousness, which is useful for some things. But we really need to shift gears into a bone consciousness to tend to those connective tissues, because they all are cold and they all move slowly, including fascia that surrounds the muscle fibers. It's cold and it moves slowly. So we just have to hold steady like the earth element, have that earth mindset, and just wait and let all of those tissues slowly come back into homeostasis eventually. So that's why the bone is mostly earth. A lot of stability, a lot of slow movement, a lot of cold movement. A lot of times we do bone exercises without warming up, just while the body's cold. It's a cold practice. And then finally, the 5% of water element. The bones help out with the electrolyte balance in the body, having to do with calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. And this is all taking place in the periosteum. I think the slide previous to this one also had a shot of the periosteum in it. Yeah. Look at that juicy thing over there to the left. So this is the water, and the periosteum that surrounds the bone is, Ayurveda would call it the mother of the bone. Here's where all the metabolic function takes place of creating bone tissue and laying down more bone density. Happens right here in the periosteum, and where that electrolyte balance is happening as well. The main organ that is associated with vata is the colon, as I mentioned, the gas quality before. So bone has a connection to the colon, and bone also is an excretory tissue. Again, it's alive, it's doing things, it's digesting things. So through the periosteum, we're sort of receiving a lot of nutrients, we're transforming them, and we're storing things in the bone as well. So byproducts of digestion can get stored here in the bone as well, whether as heavy metals or as these potassium and so on, calcium. And this is also the location where we're creating mature bone tissue out of immature bone tissue. Just to give a specialized example, cartilage is a specific special type of immature bone tissue. So that's the idea, is that it's, you know, when you're a baby, it's kind of on the way to becoming bone, but it's not quite there yet. So all of these are sort of the more watery elements of bone. They really only account for about 5% of the bone's makeup, but they are important in nourishing the bone. Nourishment is a big deal for the water element. It soothes and softens and nourishes. So there's that connection to the colon. The colon is the site of vata. The colon is the site of earth element as well. So we're storing some of the stuff from the colon in the bone here. Ayurveda, again, it really has this flux between what's literally chemically happening and what's emotionally or spiritually happening. So we can also think of the bone as sort of the repository of old unprocessed emotions. We just store stuff in the bone. A common phrase in the yoga community is that your issues are in your tissues. So when we do these slower bone practices or connective tissue practices like yin yoga, we are sort of awakening deeper parts of the tissue beyond just skin and muscle. We're getting deep into these bone tissues and its friends, and we're stirring up old imprints of emotional stuff that happened to us. So an emotional or a traumatic event happens, we have a chemical reaction to it immediately. And depending on the strength of our digestion, our subtle metabolism, a lot of that stuff, and depending on the intensity of the event, a lot of that chemical stuff kind of has to go somewhere, has to get stored somewhere. So a lot of times that can get sort of jammed into the connective tissue or the bone tissue, because the body's saying, I'm in a crisis now, I don't have time to deal with that. Just put that somewhere and I'll deal with it later. And the later is when you get into these relaxed bone postures, and then it all starts coming up. And when we start stimulating that metabolism of the bone, it says, oh, hey, you got in a car accident 5 years ago. Would you like to talk about that? And so we're processing the physical trauma that happened in the deep tissue, but we're also processing any emotional traces that might still be stored in the body from those old traumas, and they get released. Another way that bone is an excretory tissue, a waste product producer, is through the hair, nail, and the nails and the teeth. So if you remember earlier on, I mentioned that every tissue has a superior byproduct and it has a waste product. So for bones, the waste product is the hair and the nails. Now in Ayurveda, we are really interested in your waste product. We really want to know, what are the qualities of your literal stool, urine, and sweat? And are they, what are they telling you about the state of your organs? Is there a lot of dryness? Maybe we need to introduce more oils, either subcutaneously or through your diet. Is there a lot of heat coming out through your stool? Okay, what's agitated or inflamed? Is there a lot of mucus coming out? Okay, where's all that extra kapha coming from? So this is going to tell us about the state of the doshas within your body. So the individual tissue's specialized waste product will tell you about that specific tissue. So as the example I used earlier with menstrual blood representing reproductive tissue's waste product, you know, we look at that menstrual fluid and go, what does this have to tell us about how the uterus is doing? Same thing here with the bone. We look at the hair and the nails and we say, okay, tell me a story about the past 25 days of how my bone tissue has been doing. Okay, are there white dots? Are there ridges? Are there cracks? Is my hair thin and frazzled, or is it smooth, or is it, you know, has it changed in some way? Is it breaking? And these are going to tell us the doshic balance within the bone tissue. So if you've got really nice, strong, lustrous, oily nails, then you've got some good kapha, probably a decent amount of ojas helping to support your bone tissue. If you are going through a phase in your life right now where just like everything's cracking and breaking and it's too thin and frail, this is your body saying, hey, I've accumulated too much air in my bones. I need you to help me release that air, either by increasing my agni through some fire, some warmth and heat to help metabolize that air and get rid of it. Or maybe you need to reduce the amount of air qualities you're taking in, maybe less salads. Maybe you need to increase the amount of water and earth that you're taking in. But somehow we need you to rebalance the elements over the next 25 days so that the bone is not quite so vata, not quite so frail and airy. We need some other elements in there. So this is a really great diagnostic tool for yourself or for your clients as well, to look at the hair and the nails. Of course, Western medicine knows that the hair and the nails are a way for the bone to get rid of those heavy metals that we mentioned earlier. This is actually how they found out that the composer Beethoven went deaf because of lead poisoning, because they were able to examine a lock of his hair that someone had kept and look back over the timeline. Your hair grows pretty slowly, more than 25 days to grow a whole lock of hair. So you can look back through that hair and kind of see when the heavy metals were accumulating within your body. So again, another great diagnostic tool, just looking at the waste product. The superior byproduct of bone is teeth. So here we are back at digestion again. The bone is saying, here, let me help you eat things. I'm going to give you some teeth. So the teeth are another way that we can look and say, how's the bone tissue doing? So back to my example. Oh, thanks. That's right. You have pictures of teeth. I love it. Thank you. So back to the example of the female reproductive system, the superior byproduct was breast milk. So we can look at a mother's production of breast milk, and that'll tell us, oh, she must still be really depleted from labor. It's not really coming in yet. Let's give her some more ojas and build it up so that more of it comes in. Or, wow, she's got a lot, she's doing fine, she's got lots of kapha, lots of ojas. So same thing here with the teeth. We can look at the teeth and say, okay, are they chipping? Do they have cavities? Are they frail? This means that the bone is somehow not robust enough in its digestion to create good teeth. And so we need to really nourish at the bone level in order for the teeth to prosper. The teeth also are going to have this interface with kapha through the saliva. So if you have too much kapha, which is rarely an issue in our culture, most of us are really wildly vata deranged. But if for some reason you've managed to accumulate too much water and earth in your body, the saliva can get overly sweet or overly sticky. This can accumulate as tartar, and the bones of the teeth become a little encased in things. And when we need to be really stripping with our cleaning products, using maybe a baking soda or a neem toothpaste or something to really clear it off. Again, the teeth are alive, just like the bone. And if you remember, marrow tissue was equivalent to nerve tissue. So here we don't really have the marrow here in the center, but we do have the nerve tissue in the center. So we still have that connection to the next tissue that's coming after the bone. Okay, so we're getting kind of winding down more towards the esoterica of bone tissue. Let me just take a glance, make sure I'm not missing anything here. Oh, so the teeth do actually, the next slide will show the teeth are going to be equivalent to different organ function. So this is, again, just a curiosity. This is something you would learn if you want to become an Ayurvedic physician, but this is another way to diagnose. So not only do the teeth in general tell you how the bones are doing, but each specific set of teeth will tell you how that part of the body is doing. you'll see in parentheses along the right, the names of the 7 tissues in Sanskrit equated to each of the internal organs. And again, this is like, it's wheels within wheels. Ayurveda gets very complicated very quickly. I'm trying to kind of keep it a little more linear for you guys. But just a personal anecdote, if you look there at the bladder, the lateral incisors, the bladder is associated with rakta, the blood. That is the only tissue associated with pitta. My mother and my grandfather and my brother are all extremely pitta people, and they're all missing at least one lateral incisor. My mother doesn't have either. My grandfather doesn't have one, and my brother doesn't have one. And so it's almost as if that pitta was going so hot, so sharp, that it wasn't even able to slow down enough to form the bone that it represents. And there's a million other ways I can talk about my family's bodies and how it demonstrates that sort of fire element. But it burned so fast and so bright that it blew through, and it didn't even create those bones. It didn't have enough earth to create those bones. Similarly, everyone in my family's got glasses that are pretty strong prescription because the eyes are pitta, and it burns through the eyes. It just is way too hot, and so it kind of blows out your vision, so you can't see as well. Vata, with its association with hearing, could also cause hearing loss. This is why in older age we have some hearing loss. So there's that sound connection with the Vata, the sight connection with the Pitta. So just interesting stuff. You know, don't worry about it. Hopefully this isn't something to freak you out. If you look in the mirror, it's just a curiosity to kind of put things together for you, how everything's connected. And the microcosm reflects the macrocosm. In this case, the teeth reflect the whole body. So another way that Ayurveda connects things. So bone is considered a living tissue. It's almost alive in the way that certain New Age people would say, like a crystal is alive. It has a vibrational frequency, and it stores old stuff. This can be within our lifetime old emotional stuff, as I mentioned earlier, but the spiritual belief in Ayurveda also is that the past lives and the karma that you accumulate in past lives will show up as your bone is being formed in utero. So the ether element has to do with spaces, and the bone creates those cavities, the pelvic cavity, the chest cavity, the head cavity, creates spaces and distances in your body. So your bones are determining your form, your size, your shape, how you take up space. And this is said to be a result of whatever vibrational energy you're carrying through with you from a previous life. Herbs are also wise in that generational way. And so there is a real vibrational consideration when we're working with herbs and with the tissues of the body, where we can look at the way someone's bones have formed, either through a scoliosis or a very tall stature, very short stature, thick bones, thin, and we can start to kind of get an eye for what sort of vibrational frequency this person wanted to experience in this lifetime. And I don't want to go too much deeper into it than that, but just to mention that there is this very spiritual side of the bone, that it's crystallized consciousness. It is crystallized consciousness. So it's not just the byproduct of all the food and behaviors and all the tissues that came before it, but it's also the product of many lifetimes and many years of desires and spiritual vibrational factors. So that is definitely part of Ayurveda as well. And I just wanted to make sure that I touched on it here. And I did talk a little bit about yin yoga. I know we have some images of different yin yoga postures, but basically with yin yoga, yeah, you want to look at particularly the bottom row, like 10 and 11 and number 13. These are the kinds of poses that even in these images, she's using her muscles to stretch deeper. That sense of ambition lives in the muscle. Bone doesn't have that fiery ambition. Bone is receptive and stable, and it holds. It's stable, it's holding. So we would, in our yin yoga, we would completely flop and no muscular effort. And we would trust the bones to hold the weight of the body. And that's how we create that stimulation with gravity. You can think of astronauts losing bone density in space because they don't have gravity to push on their bones. So we're sort of using gravity and the literal earth as a tool to pull on the earth element of our bones. And that's going to talk to those deeper emotions. And it's also going to create that homeostasis in the ligaments that we were talking about. There is an acidic element as well with the hyaluronic acid in the connective tissue that over time in these static holds, the acids, so the pitta in the fascia, in the muscle connective tissue, is going to line up. It actually like gets in a little line, all the little acid molecules line up. So this is another way of almost describing how it can be like a lightning rod for the energy or for the life force to fly through those connective tissues. Some people believe that the meridians of acupuncture are actually traveling through the connective tissue, through the fascia. Even metaphorically, you can think of it as the space between things. It's not a muscle, it's not a bone, it's a something else. It's a something in between. And so the space, the ether in between, allows for the air, the prana, the life force to move through. So again, lots of theory, just whatever sticks is fine, and anything else that doesn't make sense, just wash it downstream. So this is pretty much what I have for Ayurveda's concept of bones. I had one or two things to share about Ayurveda's thoughts on herbs, although you could do many, many hours of lecture on herbs. But I just wanted to check, are there any questions or any thoughts that people wanted to share on everything so far about bone tissue? Doing okay? Okay. So we'll move to herbs just briefly. And again, there is so much that we could say about herbs and Ayurveda. I have a little prayer to the plants that I wanted to offer you guys. It's our last slide here is a little prayer to the plants. So here's again where we really see the spirituality coming in. Herbs are considered superior to foods because they carry more prana, more life force. In a modern Western perspective, we could say, well, sure, they have more nutrients, they have more, things to benefit, more refined chemicals packed in there that can really help the body. Whereas for food, it's a little less of a concentration of nutrition. But herbs are also helping us, again, on a spiritual, emotional, psychological level. There is an intelligence to a plant that doesn't exist in a chemical isolate. A plant is formed by nature just as a human body is formed by nature. And there's this beautiful matrix of chemicals within a plant that support one another, just like we have a beautiful matrix of chemicals, and those can talk to one another. And so Ayurveda would very much encourage you to honor the consciousness in the plants that you're using. There is a concept for the soul of the plant that is called soma, S-O-M-A. This is different from the Greek word for the body. This is a different word. It's a Sanskrit word, soma, and it means many things. It means moonlight. It means nectar. It means bliss. It means the elixir of immortality, and it means the soul of a plant. So just to kind of mull over that a little bit culturally, there's a connection between the moon, the essence of the moon, the moonlight being distilled down into the plant as the consciousness of the plant, and that this can somehow be extracted as elixirs and then introduced into our bodies. So it's the plants are sort of the medium for that pure, beautiful moonlight to get into our bodies and to nourish us from within. So if you're interested in that level of esoterica, as I am, I love all that kind of weird stuff, this is a great book to check out. This is called Soma and in Yoga and Ayurveda by Dr. David Frawley. Anything he writes is fabulous, but this is a really fun esoteric book. If you'd rather have information about herbs in a more practical, like I have arthritis, what do I eat sort of way, another book by Dr. Frawley is Ayurvedic Healing. And in this book, you can look up specific diseases and you can see, for example, let's say arthritis is a kapha condition, but you can have a pitta version of arthritis. You can have a vata version of arthritis. It all depends on what qualities are showing up in your symptoms specifically. So that's another great book to check out for that. So that's the main bulk of herbs. I did want to talk about the 6 tastes briefly with you, because again, I know that you're working more with the plants and we'll have an idea of what that means, how that translates to your herbs. And I think the 6 tastes will probably be the last thing that I have to offer for you today. So we talked about how the doshas are a combination of 2 elements. The ether in the air is vata, the fire in the water is pitta, the water in the earth is kapha. So we should balance them by eating opposite elements if they get too overaccumulated. How do we know how to get those elements? Through the taste of our foods and our herbs. So the first taste is sweet. The sweet taste is a combination of water and earth. So if you have too much pitta, too much heat, or if you have too much vata, too much dryness, you're going to reach for sweet herbs, and they're going to balance that out by giving you the water and the earth element, again, the demulcent things that you need, and the cooling aspect that you need to soothe all of that. The second taste is sour. So sour is a combination of fire and earth. So the vata element doesn't have any fire, doesn't have any earth. So if you need some more fire, if you need to stoke that metabolism and a little bit more earth, if you need to stoke your fire in a way that is grounded, you're going to reach for your sour things. And those are citruses, vinegars, things that have been fermented, pickles, that sort of thing. So it's going to awaken the digestive system. I know you guys are doing a vinegar blend later today, so it's just an interesting example of how the sour of the vinegar is going to support your digestion to be able to assimilate all of those beautiful nutrients that are inside of it. The next taste is salty. Salty is a blend of fire and water. So again, if we have too much of that vata element, too dry, not retaining enough fluid, we're going to reach for salty things like sea vegetables or literal salts, sea salt and rock salt. Ayurveda would say you need a variety of types of salt. So don't just reach for that pink Himalayan salt every single time. We also want some rock salts or black salt or other things, sea salt, something other than just the same kind, because we want the diversity of the minerals coming in through the salt. The fourth taste is pungent. This is a little different than what I'm familiar with Western herbalism. I know Western herbalism has also spicy and acrid and a few others. We don't have those in Ayurveda. We have pungent, which covers everything from wasabi to cayenne to cardamom. Even lavender has a little pungency. So pungent is just heating, warming in some way. Again, this is going to stimulate the fire. It's made of fire and air, so it's particularly good if you've got a lot of kapha. So for example, reaching for that black pepper if you've got a lot of extra mucus to clear it out. So spicy things are going to help reduce kapha. The fifth taste is bitter. Bitter is air and ether, so that's the same as the elements that created vata. So bitter is going to be tricky with the bone tissue. It can aggravate vata, which will then deteriorate bone tissue if it's taken too much. So the bitter tastes we want to use, again, more for kapha, or for pitta, when you need to cool something down or when you need to dry something out or lighten it up. And then we're going to reach for the bitter ones. The reason the bitter is good for digestion, according to Ayurveda's thinking, is that sometimes the pitta can overaccumulate its own water element, and the digestion can get a little, I guess you could say like sloshy, like too many hot, wet, acidic things going on in the belly. And so we use the bitter to dry up the water, and we're left with just the fire element, which is the metabolic function. And so now we have a more efficient digestive system because we've dried up the extra water and we've just left the fire of the pitta behind. So it's a little like an algebra equation, but that's why the bitter is going to help with the pitta. And the sixth and final taste of the Ayurvedic system is astringency. They always use the example of an unripe banana peel for astringency, which is such an unpleasant thought, but it really kind of gets the idea that astringent is very dry. Astringent is made out of air and earth. These are the same elements that are mostly present in the bone tissue. So we can use astringency for bone tissue with moderation because we don't want to use so much of it that it aggravates vata. But it would be better to use an astringent than a bitter. The astringent would be a little less depleting to the bone tissue than the bitter would, because the bitter has the air and ether, doesn't have the earth element. Astringent has air and earth. So it's a little more grounded. Astringent things are going to be a lot of your antioxidants, a lot of pomegranate, cranberry, those sorts of things. So the astringency is the final taste. And this is just sort of a way that we can calibrate what's coming into the body. So what amount of sour do you take in, and what amount of heat do you feel in your body, and do you want to change that dynamic a little bit? So that's what I have for you as for the 6 tastes. So that's pretty much it for me for Ayurveda. I know I've been talking for a very long time, so thank you for listening. I'm more than happy to take any questions if you have them, or clarify things, or if you have a strong objection or reaction, we can talk through that as well. Thank you for your time.
That was great, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, Lacey. It's fun to share it.
Yeah. I'm really interested to collaborate a little bit on the next part when we talk about herbs, when it comes to the tastes and things, because I think there's like some interesting similarities and differences there.
Yes, I agree. They are definitely different. It's funny how they can be different, but yet both systems work in their own way. So it's fun to talk about for sure.
Yeah. How's everyone doing?
My head is spinning a little bit. There's a lot
It's understandable. It's a lot. You know, if you understood it all the first time, it meant you missed something. It's a lot.
Julie, I had a question about yin yoga.
Yeah.
When it comes to just kind of like bones and different constitutions, and like I was going to Michelle's classes for a while and really enjoying her yin classes, but then I started to kind of question whether I was the right person for yin classes.
Oh yeah.
I feel like I already have a lot of flexibility in my joints, and like that's something that I worry about as a physical laborer in farming.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I started to kind of question, like, is yin the right practice for me?
That's a great question. It is definitely something we discuss when we're doing our yoga teacher trainings. So the thing to remember about yin yoga is that it can create homeostasis. So if you're overstretched and overextended, it can actually shorten the ligaments and bring them back to homeostasis there. So it can create that stability in some cases. I think the thing to understand again is that Ayurvedically, ligaments and fascia, these are all sub-tissues of muscle. So you're still working in the muscular elements. You're not working as much with the bone. So there are certain poses that are specifically designed to put pressure on the bone. And those are the ones that I think you would really benefit from the most. So I almost would have to demonstrate it, because I've tried to look on the internet for pictures of them and they just don't exist anywhere, unfortunately. But there's something called goat pose, which is where you stand almost like you're wearing skis with your legs turned in a little bit and you drop into your bones. That is fabulous for stimulating bone tissue and for the colon health as well. And then there's certain things you can do, like if you're on your hands and knees and you crisscross your shins and then shift your weight backwards, you'll feel your shins push against each other. And you'll feel your shin almost bow underneath you a little bit. So there's poses like that that are not frequently used in yin yoga, although they can be. The stillness is good for bone. The tension is good for the connective tissue, if that makes sense. So it's such a hair's difference in practice, but yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have questions?
It's hard to know what to ask sometimes. It's a lot.
All right, well, why don't we take a break? Why don't we do 10 minutes of turning your camera off and go get some water, and we'll meet back here at 1:45. All right.
So in that sense,
What was that?
in that sense, someone would practice that just for a short amount of time, then go back to something that isn't.
You could. So the thing is, with Ayurveda, we would say anything can be a medicine or anything can be a poison. So, right? So it depends on the time of the year, the type of body, the phase of life that they're in, right? So if this was someone pretty young, still in their kapha phase of life, it's early spring, everything's wet and cold outside, it's a morning practice, it's that like blow your nose time of day in the morning, do a 2-hour Bikram practice, and that's going to really help. Like, that's going to be a real medicine. Maybe you do it every day in the month of March, because that's a really kapha time of year.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Right? But if it's a person who's very vata, maybe they're in their, older time of life, maybe their body's already kind of dry, or if it's someone who overheats easily, then they really don't want to do it in the summer. Maybe they only do Bikram yoga in January and then just abandon it the rest of the year. So you just kind of have to think of it as a medicine, and you only take the medicine when you need it. If that makes sense.
Thanks.
Yeah, but nothing is like across the board bad. Everything has some qualities, and qualities balance other qualities. So that's it. You just think about, what do I want to balance and what do I not want to over accumulate? Also, nothing's across the board good, even salads.
Right.
Right. Nothing is a panacea.
So true.
Yeah.
Are folks ready to come back together? It's okay if you want to keep your cameras off and stuff. It's just hard for me to know if you're back. We'll go ahead and get started. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. And back to all right. So we're going to move into talking about herbs and some of the herbs that are present in our area and that we can use here. And we'll also be kind of shifting lenses a little bit, right? Like the lens that I'll be presenting is more from Western traditional herbalism. But like I said, there's so many crossovers. So I'm excited to kind of look at these different crossovers. So I think I want to say, from the Western perspective, thinking about the musculoskeletal health seems to kind of have a focus on nutrition and nutrients, right? Like a big focus on the building blocks of life and the building blocks of cells. So it's kind of that chemistry lens. But then also there's a focus on fluids from the Western perspective. So we're thinking a lot about the synovial fluids and the impact that the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system has in the nourishment of our tissues and the the bones, and kind of where that fluid goes or how it acts in the body. And that's a major way in which, in the Western perspective, there's some diagnostic tools. There's also folks, of course, that use tongue diagnosis and pulse diagnosis in the Western tradition. And so that's also, again, kind of thinking about like what's happening with the pulse. So what's happening in the blood that tells us what's going on in the body, as well as what Julie was pointing to with looking at the skin, the hair, the nails, right? So looking at this outer part of our body so that we can see what's happening potentially on the inner part of the body. That's a little harder to access. So when we talk about each of the herbs, I've kind of ordered them a little bit based on the physical structures that they seem to have the most affinity for. But I think it's also good that we talk about the tissue states first, so that we can also kind of be thinking about that side of it. Matthew Wood is someone who talks a lot about kind of the different principles within Western herbalism. One of them being tissue states and energetics, right, which we'll talk about now. The next being affinities. So, once you've kind of discovered what your tissue states are, or what the properties of the herb are that might give you certain changes in your tissue states, then thinking about herbs that are specific to that body system. And then the last being this concept of kind of working holistically with the body and realizing that energy moves from the center out and also from the outer part of the body in, that like there's influences and energies that move in both directions. And so as we're thinking about treating things or kind of, changing the tissue states or changing the state of the body, thinking about how that changes, there are influences that come from the outside as well as influences that come from the inside. And so as Julie was talking about the 7 tissue states and kind of that cycle of 40 days, I was also kind of thinking about that third principle there, kind of like from inner to outer and outer to inner in Western medicine, Western herbalism, as being somewhat similar to that. I don't know that there are like as exact numbers around it. But there's also this concept of like it takes time for these things to occur, because there are stages kind of that it has to go through. So let's look at the tissue states. And this is tissue states in relationship to the musculoskeletal system. So we'll start with this damp stagnation. And some of the ways that we can think about damp stagnation as a tissue state when it comes to the musculoskeletal system is when there's fatigue of the muscles and this dull pain, especially after sleeping. So, after these periods of long sitting, that there's extra feelings of fatigue and extra feelings of pain, even though there should maybe have been a feeling of, respite and increased vigor. Now there's this feeling of like stuckness. And then folks that feel better when there's some warmth applied to the area. So this might be in relationship to joints, or it might be a relationship to the muscles. So this feeling that warmth is better, or a warm environment maybe is better for them. They prefer to go south for the winter, and that makes them feel better. Or when they're in cold environments and cold, wet environments, this particular set of symptoms that they're experiencing feels worse. This is also a tissue state that tends to have an affinity or an association with metabolic symptoms. So that meaning that like both the environment that they're in is very influential on how they're feeling, but also the foods and the type of foods that they're eating, and if there are sensitivities to foods, seems to be like an extra portion of what's happening in this tissue state in particular. And I wrote the word alteratives there because this is a tissue state that often indicates and points towards the need for alternatives, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And we did talk about last month with the digestive system. Does anybody remember any of the alternatives, like pop quiz before we move forward? Not really. I think last month we talked about burdock as an alternative. So yeah, we'll come back to alternatives. All right, so there's damp stagnation. Damp stagnation also sometimes can point to things like rheumatism and fibromyalgia. It's not specific to those. I know that like fibromyalgia, I think, Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, that fibromyalgia in Ayurveda is more of like a vata.
Yes, because of its association with the nervous system. However, if it's being caused by some sort of blockage or stagnation, then it could be due to kapha, which is what this sounds like, generally speaking, kapha problems.
Yeah, yep. So for all of the different kinds of illnesses or disease states that we could talk about, you know, arthritis and fibromyalgia, they can fall into all these different categories kind of based on, very similarly to what Julie was saying, what is your kind of base constitution to begin with, but also like where are you in your life and what is causing this particular set of symptoms for you. So this is one that often gets thought about in Western herbalism for fibromyalgia and rheumatism, but it's not specific to those. The word rheumatism comes from the Greek word dampness, rheuma. And so that's kind of, at least in Western herbalism, maybe where some of that association comes from, of like this overly damp situation causing what would be considered rheumatism. And back before, you know, modern medicine kind of made a bunch of differentiation between different kinds of arthritis and different, you know, like fibromyalgia being specific to muscles and arthritis being specific to joints. Previous forms of understanding kind of lumped these together in some sense, and would call it, you know, myalgia or rheumatism was kind of like a catch-all for these body aches that did have different ways of being approached, but were often kind of lumped together. Whereas now in modern medicine, we separate them into separate categories. So we have damp stagnation. Damp stagnation also tends to have like an inflammatory response, but a inflammatory response that again is kind of like hinged on metabolic wastes and the wastes building up in stagnation and not being able to move them. So there is still, you know, an inflammatory response that happens, right? But it's not going to be caused by the dryness that we might think of typically when we think of joint pain. So I just wanted to like make that point, I guess. There's damp relaxation. So this is when there are excess fluids leaving or staying in the body. This is where we might think of osteoporosis from calcium leaching, things like kidney stones and overflexibility in the joints. This is a lax tissue state. And so we're thinking about water and dampness residing in inappropriate places in the body here. And in regards to the musculoskeletal system, there's often a demineralization that's happening of the bones and a weakening of the bones. And the excess minerals from the bones are what's causing some of the possibility for things like kidney stones and other sorts of stones that are forming. And overall, there's just a laxity in the tissues and the tone that impacts both the connective tissues as well as the joints. So also thinking about things like ulceration in the legs and kind of venous pooling in the legs, right? So there's like too much laxity, not enough tone. Next we have wind and tension, right? So wind here, like wind is not actually usually a word that's used in Western herbalism, but a lot of herbalists are now kind of adopting that style of thinking about it and that word, right? Borrowing it from traditional Chinese medicine as well as Ayurvedic medicine. So in this case, we're talking about wind and tension. And so this is, I guess, probably what would be considered vata, Julie?
Yes, I think so, because the vata is so dry, it can cause constriction of tissues, and that sounds like what's happening here with the spasming and the hardness. Vata can become hard because it's so dry.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we're thinking about wind or tension, right, we're thinking muscle spasms, this feeling of being twisted, tight, yeah, hard, just the inability to relax, and then poor circulation that's happening because of this tenseness. And when we're thinking about, doing a pulse or tongue association with this, the pulse is very hard, it's very tense, it's wiry, and the tongue might have vibrations or, kind of be shaking as it's leaving the mouth. This is where a lot of folks that kind of straddle nutrition and Western herbalism will think of putting magnesium like as a first kind of line of defense, or a first kind of line of working on this problem, right? Is magnesium is so important in the relaxation of muscles, and when there's this state of being rattly and kind of spastic, for some folks that might be an indication that they don't have enough magnesium in their diet, or they're not properly metabolizing that magnesium. And so that's a place to start for a lot of people that fall into this category. Generally, these folks have worse symptoms when they are cold, and they respond well to heat and warmth, which allows their muscles to relax. So these might be the kind of people that relax when they get into a hot tub or a sauna, because they're feeling that relief. And then there's often kind of arterial constriction and poor circulation that's kind of coming from that tenseness and dryness. So things aren't able to move smoothly, and so you might have structural alignment that is happening, misalignment that's happening in the body because of these overly tight and tense muscles or other tissues. All right, and then we have dry and atrophy. So dry and atrophy, we're thinking of this as dry and creaky joints and bones, dry skin, dry mucous membranes, right? So that mucous membranes, I'm thinking like constipation, or also like just kind of dry, rattly lungs and respiratory. And then muscles that are wasting or shriveling, and a really dry tongue. I'm thinking in general of just kind of musculoskeletal weakness. And often in this kind of state, in Western herbalism, we're thinking of adding oils and adding lubrication and adding cushioning at this point, right? So again, thinking about how in Western herbalism, we're really concerned about the fluids and where the fluids are and aren't. And in this picture, we're seeing that there's really just not enough lubrication there. And so there's a lot of pain that's coming potentially from this atrophy and the muscles not being able to, expand and contract the way that they're supposed to, and a brittleness that forms because of a lack of fluid. And then heat and excitation. So this is sharp pain. I'm thinking, herniated discs, kind of sharp pain where there's radiating pain rather than a dull pain that might be more associated with damp relaxation or damp stagnation. So heat, excitation, more of a sharp pain, more of a radiation. There's, redness of the skin, heat in the joints. It responds well to cooling remedies, and, generally to things like the rose family that are very cooling both to the nervous system, but also to the tissues. This is also a tissue state or condition picture where there's autoimmune symptoms present. So again, this might be another form of fibromyalgia. Like some folks might fall more into the damp stagnation form of fibromyalgia, and some folks might fall more into this heat and excitation. I think where it can be difficult to kind of look at your own symptoms or the symptoms of a family member and to try to figure out kind of where their particular symptoms and experiences are falling in these tissue states is that, you know, as we've talked about for the last couple of classes, inflammation is the body's way of healing itself. And so we know with inflammation that there is, right, heat, there might be some edema happening. We will often experience some form of pain. And so I feel like this heat and excitation tissue state can be particularly difficult to kind of see as opposed to these other states. Or maybe, I guess I want to rephrase that. I feel like it's easy to see the heat and excitation of inflammation and think that the whole experience that's being had is heat and excitation, whereas pain and redness and you know, edema can come from all of these in different ways. They present themselves a little bit differently, but the one that we kind of gravitate towards and can see most easily is this heat and excitation. Does that make sense to everybody? Gonna take that as a yes. Okay. For this one, if you're thinking about tongue and pulse, the tongue is typically going to be red and like pointed, and then the pulse will be more rapid, superficial, bounding. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the different anatomical parts that Western medicine seems to focus on a lot when it comes to thinking about bone health and musculoskeletal health. And so this is a picture of a joint here, right? But there's a slit down the middle, and the difference here is osteoarthritis on the left and rheumatoid arthritis on the right. And I wanted us to look at cartilage, right, and how it kind of hugs the bone there on both sides. And then also synovial fluid that kind of moves in and around those joints. I wanted to share this quote from Matthew Wood that kind of, I think, shows a little bit how Western herbalism thinks about the fluids as being so important when thinking about what's happening in the body. So he says, "We can well see the pivotal position which the primary yin fluid of the joints, the synovial fluids, play in the health of the muscular and skeletal system. It feeds and cleanses the cartilaginous parts and lubricates the cartilage, bone, tendons, and muscles. If it dries out, the joint will become stiff, malnourished, and perhaps inflamed, dry atrophy. If it becomes stagnant, the joint will become dirty and inflamed. Dirty here is in kind of quotes. And this is an example of damp stagnation. And if it collects in the excess, the joint will be puffy, swollen, and subject to backing up stagnation from the kidneys and lymphatics. If the joint is supplied by a rich bloodstream, full not only of food and oxygen, but of immune factors, the joints will tend to become hot from a high metabolic rate and immune activity. And this is heat and excitation. Conversely, poor circulation leaves the joints cold and malnourished. And this is what he would categorize as cold and depression. So I point that out just to say that, like, from the Western perspective, right, there's a lot of thoughts about like whether or not we have this fluid and how to get more of it. So the herbs that we're going to be thinking about are herbs that both help build fluid and protect fluid, but also herbs that help to kind of give tone or laxity to the muscles so that fluids can move easier through them. So the synovial fluid that's surrounding this joint here is the fluid that functions to carry the nutrients and oxygen from the blood and then to bathe all of our tissues in it. The joints are encased in these fluid-filled sacs, And that maintains the lubrication that the structures need, the bones need, to be able to move without grinding on each other. And these sacs can actually be, ruptured, and they can tear, and those synovial fluids can leak. And over time, with these different conditions like arthritis and osteoarthritis, like, we can see that both the cartilage and the synovial fluids can change over time and can be damaged. Here's another picture just to kind of show these differences, right? We have the healthy joint here on the left, where there's lots of space between these bones. There's that nice fluid sac that's happening there. And then we have the osteoarthritis, where we're seeing that, that cartilage and those sacs really being, stressed and depleted there. And we're really seeing in that rheumatoid arthritis that it's very much kind of a bone on bone, right? That looks very, very unhappy there. The osteoarthritis is the most common form of arthritis. This affects millions of Americans in particular. And this is a gradual decay and wearing down of the cartilage in the joints, and it decreases the cushion that the joints have there. Rheumatoid arthritis, on the other hand, is a degenerative autoimmune disease where the immune system is literally attacking the joints and the structural tissues of the body and those connective tissues. And this, depletes those joints of the ability to have those, those supporting structures there for them. And we did talk about this a little bit last month when we talked about digestion, in that so many of the things that we as a people might have intolerances to or allergies to are proteins, and that those same sequences of proteins can be found often in our connective tissues and in these kind of supportive structures. And when there is kind of this long-term inflammation that's happening in the gut, especially around leaky gut, and then the antibodies that are being produced to find those same proteins will eventually, potentially, over time, start attacking some of our actual proteins in the body that make up our support structures. And then we have this case where the self is attacking the self, even though these antibodies have been made to try to protect us from things like wheat or, corn or soy, or things that are causing these reactions in our gut, now are wreaking havoc on our musculoskeletal system. So the first one I want to talk about for herbs that addresses kind of the synovial fluid is oat straw. What do folks know about oat straw already? I know a lot of you have probably used oat straw. Who wants to share what they know about oat straw? Or oats in general? Everyone's so quiet today. Okay. So I think that for a lot of herbalists, we kind of covet and get really excited about the milky oats up top, right? Those oats that come out, and then when the grain is going through the phase of milking, we're harvesting it to get that plant latex, because it's such a nourishing plant, little package for our nervous system, and particularly for the myelin sheath and things like that. When we're thinking about musculoskeletal health, though, we're thinking a little bit more about the oat straw. So that's below the oat heads there. The actual straw part is actually a separate harvest. And the oat heads are taken and used for the nervous system, and then the oat straw is really what a lot of folks will use for their nourishing infusions, right? So they're chopping that up, they're putting that into a jar, they're filling that with their hot water and letting it sit overnight for 6 to 8 hours to extract. And a lot of folks, think of this as being one of the herbs in their rotation that they'll use for, kind of in place of taking like a multivitamin, they would use oat straw. And that's definitely a wise practice that I think has developed over time, because oat straw is a plant that is high in so many different vitamins and nutrients. And then the straw in particular is a good source of silicon. And so the silicon is helpful in cartilage health, and um, it supports us also in our needs for our, having good hair, skin, and nails. And we see a lack of the silicon when we start seeing brittle skin and hair and nails, and skin that doesn't heal very well, that wounds that don't seem to heal as well as we'd like them to, or take a long time to. Those things that I just pointed out, the kind of lackluster hair and like wounds that don't heal well, can also be caused by other things. And one of those things being that like maybe there is enough minerals in the body, but we're not doing a great job of absorbing them or distributing those nutrients. And so that's, that kind of points to some other concerns, but this is a plant that we can use in that way. So this is one that you could do a vinegar infusion with, like we'll demonstrate this afternoon, or it's one that tastes really lovely. I mean, it tastes just very grassy and neutral in a lot of ways, and so a lot of folks will use this as an infusion, a strong infusion. All right, horsetail is another one that is thought of a lot for kind of the cartilage health. Do folks know about horsetail at all? Does anybody have experience using horsetail? No? Okay. So horsetail is a plant that, it's kind of an interesting plant, right? Like you can see from the picture here that it's a plant that has like all these little knobs and joints, which like if we're thinking about how the way a plant presents itself also kind of tells us maybe something about what it does, the doctrine of signatures. Like this is a plant that I think of kind of like you see those little connectors in there, right? And it makes me think of the connective tissues and that picture that we just looked at before with the, the cushion there between the joints. You can almost kind of imagine that like these little segments of the horsetail are the bones, and that little white band there is like the cushion between the cartilage and synovial fluids between. So this is a remedy that often gets thought of under the atrophy tissue state because of its ability to help rebuild connective tissue and bone. It's generally a plant that's thought of to having high levels of silica. And again, silica is a plant that we think of as useful for, nutritionally for these connective tissues. And then this again is one that just kind of like the oats that we're thinking of, people that have nails that have become pitted or broken or thin. The skin doesn't heal quickly enough. The hair cracks and splits easily. A lot of folks will find horsetail in recipes for like skin and hair, applications. So if you get any kind of herbal books on, skincare, horsetail will often make its way into those recipes a lot. It's also a plant that a lot of folks think of, like oats actually, as a plant that is good for folks that tend to be nervous or overwhelmed, and kind of get into this habitual pattern of biting their nails, twisting their hair, picking their skin. And so we think about this as a plant that's nourishing in ways that is different from a nervine, but a lot of the things that we look for, this like twisting of the hair and biting of the nails, also falls under the nervous system. And when we get to the end of kind of talking about these herbs, I'll also have a slide that says like, again, like everything in the body is connected, right? So like we also have to think about all the other systems that are in part here. And Julie did such a great job of connecting the ojas, not ojas, ojas?
Ojas, yeah.
Ojas. The ojas, right? The immune system, the ojas with the nervous system, and that teeter-totter that's always happening there. And so I think that Western herbalism also sees really similar things there, and a lot of the herbs that we think of for, dealing with, these structural concerns or these structural pains are also deeply connected to the nervous system and how our overall health and immunity is doing. This is a plant that is harvested in the early spring, generally. And It's not like many of our plants, right? This is not like what most of our plants look like. It's a pretty old plant. It's a very old family of plants. And Sanja Papam of the Evolutionary School of Herbalism says that timing is really important for harvesting, that you want to harvest it in the early spring when the little hairs there haven't reached, as far down that you want to harvest them when they're small. It's a great plant at pulling minerals from the soil, and the water that it grows on, it tends to like wet areas. So you also really want to be careful about gathering it in places that are environmentally disturbed, right? Like this is a plant that you'll see sometimes on the side of roads or around collection ponds in neighborhoods, that kind of thing. And that's not really a great place to harvest them, because it's a plant that can hold things like heavy metals in its body and can just pull up a lot of things that could impact, toxicity for us. So you kind of want to look upstream and see like what the ecosystem of that plant is, and whether or not it's best to harvest there. This is another one that does really well in vinegar. Or you could extract it into honey. That would be kind of nice. Sanja Papam also makes a great connection, I think, in general. So often when we talk about herbs, we're asking about things like, what is the specific physiology that's happening in the body, and like, do we understand the exact mechanism or nutrient that's causing this? And he says that, while this plant is usually touted for its silica, and that like silica is what's considered like its action, constituent, he also says that, it's there in the plant, but that it's not so high in the plant that that's necessarily the action, and not too many people are super deficient in silica. Most people have a sufficient amount. But what he says that I thought was really interesting about silica and horsetail is that he feels like the plant helps the body have the intelligence to utilize the silica more efficiently and effectively, right? So rather than taking silica as part of a multivitamin that, like Julie was saying, the body doesn't always know what to do with that. When we're taking silica or other, minerals in the form of a plant, it's like we're teaching the body how to use it through the breakdown of the plant, that the body should be pretty well accustomed to doing that over our evolutionary history of living with these plants. So I like that, kind of like this plant embodies the intelligence of silica. All right, and so this was from Sanja Papam, right? This is him kind of saying like, that same thing that I just said, like that the intelligence of the silica is like how to effectively and efficiently use this in the body. All right, and then nettles. What does everybody know about nettles? This is one that I know we've talked about a ton in so many different classes. So I would love to hear kind of what impressions do folks have about nettles when you're thinking about the musculoskeletal system? All right. Let me find my page. So I think of nettles in lots of different ways when it comes to the musculoskeletal system. Obviously, like kind of like the nutritional part that comes to mind for me is just that this is a plant that is so high in chlorophyll and iron and lots of different minerals and proteins. And so a lot of us will just kind of think of nettles really from that perspective of like, this is it's a superfood, right? It's like so nutrient dense. And that's, I think, a really great way to start thinking about it, is just that this is a really nourishing plant. It's a perennial plant. And I think that any perennial plants that we can engaged with in our diet is really a way to strengthen the body and the immune system, because it's coming from a complete body of the soil, right? These plants that we have to plant every year, the annuals, we are, disturbing that soil, disturbing that body of the soil every time we have to plant. And so we're kind of working from a deficit a lot of times, or the amount of stuff that we're putting into the soil to augment the soil for the benefit of the plant is oftentimes extracted from other places in the world, right? And like kind of like a vitamin, like doesn't always take in that soil right away, or it gets washed away before it can really be metabolized by the soil. And so this is a plant that is a food that we can eat, like spinach. We can, saute it. We can put it into quiches. We can make pestos out of it. And it's a plant that comes from soils that are usually whole. Again, though, this is a plant that is considered a dynamic accumulator, so it can accumulate things in its body, which is a benefit to us when it comes to nutrients, but a disservice to us when it comes to a degraded environment, or an environment that has been exposed to chemicals that we might not want to ingest. So again, just thinking about where your nettles are coming from. But there's kind of like two sides of nettles that I think of when it comes to the musculoskeletal system. So there's the side of nettles that is the ingestible side, right? So I'm thinking about chlorophyll and its ability to help us with free radicals in the body, help us to bind carcinogens and pull those out of the body. So helping to protect the DNA of our cells and the structure of our cells. I'm thinking about obviously things like iron and helping to build our blood, which then nourishes the tissues of our body. And then I'm also thinking about even the histamines that are present in the nettles, and the serotonin that is present in the nettles, and kind of the subtle effects that has on the body, right? A lot of folks will use nettles for hay fever, but it's also one that comes up again and again and again in literature for rheumatism, not just as a topical, which I'll talk about in just a second, but as an internal plant to take as well for rheumatic pains, for these muscle fatigue and pains of the body. So it's a plant that I feel like really helps us to actualize the nutrients that come into the body. This is a plant that is considered an alterative. So remember back when I was talking about damp stagnation, I said that this is a metabolic, often thought of as a metabolic tissue state that needs metabolic intervention. And nettles is a plant that helps us to break down nutrients, distribute nutrients well, and then eliminate wastes from the body. So as a food, as a tea. And then topically, we can also think about this for muscle pain as a flagellant. So actually hitting ourselves with the nettles so that we can increase circulation to that portion of the body and increase, potentially increase the immune capacity in that part of the body, because if we have an active injury, that part of the body needs reinforcement. It needs new blood cells to be coming in. It needs the lymphatic system to be taking wastes out. And so by bringing in this kind of fresh stimulation through the act of physically stinging yourself, you're encouraging that process to continue. Has anyone done that before? Used urtication as a way of addressing an injury or pain? So I've been experimenting with it this week. I did some overzealous weeding and, kind of damaged my wrist and elbow, and they've been kind of achy and uncomfortable. And I've been using Solomon seal and cayenne and some of the things that we'll talk about, with a couple of the other herbs. But I've also been thinking about, how to bring relief of pain for myself, but also increase the ability of my body to work on, this overexertion in a restorative way. And so I did just my wrist, actually, even though my wrist and my elbow felt the same. They both ached at the same kind of frequency and intensity. I just did my wrist so I could kind of do a comparison. And I was really surprised by how I felt the rest of that day in particular. You know, I got the little red welts and the stinging, felt the burning sensation and kind of tingling. And then once that subsided, which for me was, you know, maybe 10 minutes or so, for the rest of that day, I felt like I had more range of mobility in my wrist without pain. But I did feel like also there was just like more blood flow to my hand in general. My elbow continued to be achy and actually felt a little more achy. I don't know if that was like just the absence of some pain in the wrist kind of amplified the pain in the elbow, but I've been continuing to now sting my whole arm and kind of see like how that works. And Jim McDonald has a really great story that he tells, that he started to develop a little bit of like a carpal tunnel like syndrome in his wrist. And he said that, you know, he recognized it right away that, you know, that's what was happening, some kind of repetitive strain there. And he thought, you know, I could just go ahead and treat this right away. It's, you know, only been a couple of days, but I know that when most people come to me to see me as an herbalist, they've waited a long time, right? They come to me because they've waited for months and now they have pain every day. And now they're really uncomfortable and they're looking for help. They didn't come to me when they got the first little pang of discomfort. And so he did an experiment where he allowed himself to not treat himself for a while and just kind of ignore it and see what happened. And when he was, you know, experiencing pain every day, he then decided to use nettle stinging multiple times a day on his arm, as well as Solomon seal. And he said, you know, within, I think it was 3 to 4 days, it had resolved itself and you know, didn't come back after that for him. So I thought that was a really cool story that he shared. And also like, I share that perspective with him sometimes where like when something unpleasant happens in my body, there's a little bit of like pleasure that I get from that of like, ooh, I get to try this thing now. Isn't that exciting? All right. So thinking about the muscles, tendons, ligaments, there's also some herbs that we think of kind of specifically for those. So tendons, you see here, connect the muscle to the bone, and ligaments connect bone to bone. And both of them are, you know, subject to tears and sprains and, you know, being unhappy and giving us, you know, a bit of grief, or causing grief in the joints or bones then that now feel unstable or feel like they've been compromised, right? Because the job of the ligaments and the tendons, as Julie was saying, right, is like to act as stability, and they have to kind of be that intermediary between this, you know, thing that's kind of solid and stable, and then this other thing that we expect to respond right away and be able to perform all of these tasks without a problem. So they have to, you know, be in that middle space and really be pretty quite flexible about how and where they react. Solomon seal is definitely an herb that comes up a lot in this area of tendons and ligaments, particularly because it's a plant that is thought of for the joints. And so when we're thinking about how, you know, especially these ligaments, right, that are connecting bone to bone and have to do that difficult work, the Solomon seal is a really great moistening plant in particular. It's a sweet plant. The root is what we're using. And in Western medicine, the sweet flavor is what we think of for nutritive as a tonic. So this is a plant that is native to our region here in North America, and is a plant that is experiencing over-harvesting. And so we do really need to be careful about where and how we're harvesting it. But it was a plant that has been used as a food plant for many peoples, because it's a tuber, basically a rhizome, I guess is the correct name, that has all these carbohydrates and starches in it that taste sweet. So folks will take Solomon seal both topically. You can put it into a salve, or internally as a tincture is often the way that it'll be used. Or you could dry it and decoct it as a decoction, a strong tea. not Jim Duke, sorry, Jim McDonald recommends harvesting it by following the stem down with your fingers. And then the rhizomes actually grow really close to the surface. They're not very deep down at all. So you follow it down to that rhizome, and then you kind of work your way in with your fingers back from the stem. And the reason it's called Solomon seal, here's the flowers. The reason it's called Solomon seal is that each year when it grows, it creates this little seal, right? Kind of like if you can imagine the seals, the wax seals that folks used to use to emboss things or to, to close an envelope. It creates this seal. And so you can kind of move down the root of the plant away from that flowering part and snap off a part of the root further down so that you're not digging up the whole plant ever, right? So you're just kind of like using your fingers. This really only works in soils that aren't, heavy clay, right? So it has to be growing in a place where you can kind of move your fingers around it. And he's in Michigan, so I guess maybe there's some different kinds of soils up there. It's hard for me to imagine that this would be like super possible in Maryland with the clay that we have. I think it would be more likely that you could kind of find the stem, and the flowers and the leaves are usually pointing away from the rest of the root. So you could kind of follow it back on top on the soil, and then kind of try to dig your hands or a tool down further away from the plant to see if you could find it from further back. I think that would probably make more sense in this case. So Solomon seal, let me find what else I wanted to say about Solomon seal. So it's a sweet tonic, like I was saying, and it's useful in dry and atrophy states. It's a cooling demulcent, right? So demulcent being moistening, and useful for excessive heat and inflammation. When we think about the doctrine of signatures, this is a plant that we look at and think might look like kind of the knobby fingers of somebody who has arthritis, right? Or like the joints there being swollen and kind of misshapen. So this is a plant that has been thought of for a long time in that way. It's because they look like bones, they look like the connective tissues. This is a remedy that's considered amphoteric. Does everybody know that word, amphoteric? Another herb that's amphoteric that I can think of is yarrow. Amphoteric means that it helps bring the body to homeostasis, whether you have excess or a deficiency. So it acts on the tissue as they need. So in this regard, we think about it as tissues or tissues that are overly lax will be tightened up, and then ones that are overly toned will be loosened up. Right? So we might feel pain in the joints or pain in where bones come together for lots of different reasons. And this is a plant that has so many uses in the musculoskeletal system because it's an amphoteric, because it's one that can kind of help us regardless of which side of the spectrum we're on. It also has an affinity for prolapsed organs. And from the Chinese perspective, it's considered a yin tonic because of its moistening nature. It's one that often gets added to a lot of other formulas. You can use it alone for sure, but it's one that tends to do really well when it has some other herbs with it. And I think the next slide may be, here's false Solomon seal. Just to show you the difference, the Solomon seal that we harvest from, the flowers are below, and it has these opposite leaves, alternate leaves. And then the false Solomon seal has very similar shape in the leaves, but the flowers come out of the top. There are some other ways to distinguish it as well when it's not flowering, but that's one of the big ones that folks look for. All right, here's Jim McDonald saying that Solomon seal is perfectly suited as a base upon which to blend formulas, and well-crafted combinations potentiate its effectiveness. St. John's wort is indicated if there is nerve involvement, numbness, tingling, shooting, or searing pains, right? So I definitely think of St. John's wort for things like herniated discs. Mullein root if there is a misalignment involved, either in the way bones are healing together or in cases of spinal curvature and subluxations. Horsetail to aid in the healing of bones and cartilage. Black cohosh for dull, achy, inflammatory pain in the muscles or for whiplash. A teeny tiny bit of golden seal for injured discs. He learned that from Matt Wood. Arnica for pain from injuries, teasel for muscle injuries and tears, blue vervain if there's a lot of tension in the nape of the neck and upper shoulders, especially if this results in rigid, self-imposed idealism. Oh, wow. Yarrow if there is bruising, blood stagnation, or conversely bleeding, right? Yarrow being another amphoteric. Lobelia if there is severe muscle spasms, fresh nettle applied, yes, stung, externally for tendinitis. You get the picture. It combines really well. So this is one that we will often see. And it's interesting because the salve that I have of Solomon seal, I bought it a few years ago, actually, at when I was part of Wild Ginger, which was then Centre Roche's year 2. We went to the ginseng symposium in Morgantown, and they had some folks that were selling herbs there. And I bought what they called it an achy breaky salve, because it just had herbs in it that I was curious to kind of see how they combine together. And it has things like oxeye daisy in it, and cayenne pepper, and Solomon seal, and right, so it's meant for like achy and breaky bones. But it's so interesting that they chose to infuse it into shea butter, which I don't think probably was the right thing to do. I love shea butter, what it does for my skin. But I don't feel like shea butter is a great penetrator. Well, we know it's not a great penetrator of the different layers of the skin, and so if
Is that because it's too hard, the shea butter?
shea butter, yeah, yep, yeah, it's too thick.
Too thick,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's with the skin being so lipid heavy already, the lipid, like that lipid content from the shea butter really just stays on top and like stays on the surface, right? If I was going to make my own Solomon seal, a bit something that I was going to use, I would probably infuse it into something like sunflower oil or olive oil that has like a high linoleic acid content, and then I might make more of a liniment out of it, where I would include some rubbing alcohol in there to disrupt the lipid barrier so that I could get more penetration into the tissues, rather than like shea butter is what I think of for protecting the skin when it comes to skin that is overly dry, is being washed too much, right? Like right now is a great time for shea butter because we're all washing our hands a bunch. But I don't think of shea butter as being very useful at all for muscle penetration. What I've been doing with that, because it is made of shea butter, is applying it more often and applying it with some heat to try to, open the pores and try to hopefully encourage more penetration from that product. But I would say that it would be better to use different solvents for that herb. I've never tried it internally. I don't really have a lot of access to it. I have some Solomon seal plants here, but it's not one that I've felt comfortable buying yet because I just know how over-harvested it is. So I'm trying to grow some here so that I can feel more comfortable harvesting it and using it.
Have you seen it in the wild before?
I have, yeah. I have seen it in small amounts, like around the Appalachian Trail.
Oh.
Yeah. All right. So I want to move into muscles. And there are a bunch of muscles in the body, right? So we're not going to go into all the different kinds of muscles. But when we're thinking about pain or discomfort, there are two types of muscles that often come into play with this. The smooth muscles, where we're thinking about things like the smooth muscles that are part of peristalsis in our gut, as well as like the smooth muscles that are part of our uterus. So, menstrual cramps, that kind of thing. The muscles that I'll be talking about kind of more specifically with these herbs is more of the skeletal muscles, which are made up differently. The fibers are different, organized differently. than the smooth muscles. There are definitely some crossovers though, you know, when it comes to herbs. Cayenne. So Julie mentioned cayenne, right, as being like a very fiery pitta, and Western herbalism thinks of it the same way. It's definitely considered a pungent, stimulating, moving herb. And in a lot of cases, when you see it in recipes for muscle rubs, right, like something like this, like a cayenne salve, we're intentionally trying to create stimulation on the surface of the skin that's going to penetrate into that muscle. We're trying to warm up that muscle potentially, right? I think of cayenne a lot for things like stiff joints, and stiffness that kind of comes from, you know, I guess could come from atrophy, but also thinking of more often like stiffness that comes from, excuse me, like a dampness or a stagnation that needs some stimulation. But again, this is kind of based on also people's constitutions and like, do they feel better when they apply heat or do they feel better when they apply cool? And that will also kind of like tell you which direction you should be going with and whether or not, you know, cayenne salve makes sense. When I see it in a lot of books, cayenne salves will just kind of be like, put this on sore muscles. And yeah, I think that obviously there's a bit more distinction there to think about rather than just like this goes on all sore muscles. Cayenne salve, actually, I like to use in the winter on my feet for stimulation because I get cold feet in the winter. And so if I put a little bit of cayenne salve on my feet before bed, that seems to help me not have chilly feet while I'm trying to fall asleep. And so definitely for me, I find it very stimulating, and it's both nettles and cayenne are talked about as being plants that you experience some pain with, and that pain is often kind of routed through substance P. So substance P being this, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not coming to me. Substance is the only word coming to me. That's not the word. Substance in the body that tells the brain, right, through these channels that we're seeing here, tells the brain that there is pain, that there is something, you know, superficial pain that's happening on the skin. And the theory a lot of times is that like when we're hitting ourselves with nettles or when we're putting cayenne directly on the skin, the body is depleting of substance P in that area, and that's one of the reasons that we don't feel pain for a certain amount of time. This study that I read through the British Journal of Anesthesia actually looked at capsaicin in particular and said that, you know, while there might be some of that happening, right, that there's some substance P depletion, what they saw was more likely is that there was a defunctionalization that was happening in the mitochondria of the cells as they were experiencing the capsaicin, and that was giving a depleted or like a length of time in which people were not experiencing pain for a while because there was actual dysfunctioning happening. Here's another way of looking at that, just like another schematic of that, right? The capsaicin coming in. And then they were doing a little bit of study also on kind of the depth of the dysfunction or the amount of time of the dysfunction had to do with capsaicin concentration. And this is something that we think about with herbalism as well, right? When we're making a salve or putting something like cayenne powder on the skin, right, is the amount of cayenne powder or salve we should be using, how often we should be using it. And so I think that with cayenne in particular, I would very much encourage you to move slow with it and test, you know, your skin to make sure that that is a remedy that is beneficial for you. Capsaicin and the cayenne is a rubefacient, so it is going to make your skin red, right? And then it is also considered an analgesic in that like it takes away pain after that initial burn and that initial you know, sensation that we get. But it is also a plant that can be highly aggravating to a lot of people, both internally and externally. So I would say if you're going to work with cayenne, you know, do so with some with some caution. I have a recipe here from Thomas Easley. Let's see, where's that recipe? So he uses 1 part cayenne powder, 30 parts olive oil, and he rubs that in the skin 3 times per day if there's, you know, muscle pain. So 30 parts olive oil, that's pretty big. And then another recipe is 1 part cayenne powder, 1 part mullein leaf, and 1 part slippery elm. And I actually put okra as an alternative for slippery elm. And then enough apple cider to moisten the mixture to make a poultice. You can put oil on your skin first if you think this is going to be a little too intense, and then you put that poultice on the skin. You could also rub cayenne tincture into the skin diluted with 2 parts rubbing alcohol.
Can cayenne potentially burn the skin?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and obviously, like, mucous membranes are very, very open to being burned as well, right? So, you know, making sure that you're washing your hands super well after using something like this, right? But also, like, not putting it on skin that might have a, you know, an open cut that you didn't realize was there. So being cautious of that. But yeah, it can actually burn the skin. Thomas Easley says that cayenne is contraindicated when there's already sensitive mucous membranes, when there's already inflammation of mucous membranes, right? So this is internally. And then when there's excessive mucus discharge already. Which I thought was kind of interesting. Julie, do you have any thoughts about that, the excessive mucus discharge?
Yeah, so this is basically, excessive mucus would be excess kapha dosha. And so when I was talking about, we want to cook our kapha into ojas, we want to process the extra kapha into immune function. But if you have just too much of it or not enough metabolic fire in yourself, then you need to get that fire from another source. And this would be our spices and our capsaicin and our cayenne. And that's basically adding pitta to your body so that it can cook and transform that extra kapha.
So in Ayurveda, with excess mucus, you would use cayenne?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'm curious to know why Thomas Easley's book recommends it being contraindicated, that you should not use it when there is excess mucus discharge. That seemed contraindicated. Like, that didn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I have had the experience in my own body of excess mucus in the sinuses being a result of underlying dryness and heat and inflammation in the sinuses, and my own body was trying to correct it by bringing some mucus in. So I found removing excess spices from my diet reduced mucus, interestingly, which is, like you're saying, very counterintuitive. But it's because the mucus was a secondary reaction to a different underlying issue.
Yeah.
Lacey.
Yeah.
It's Christina. Are they talking about excess mucus topically, or, you know, because that's different? Like when he's saying avoid cayenne topically, like, so if you have an area that's inflamed that might be oozing or might have too much of a white blood cell accumulation, you know, where it starts to form clotting or things like that. That's what they're talking about in the excess mucus, right? Or the way with the doshas, it seems like you're talking about more internal excess mucus.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I don't know. I was assuming that he meant internally with excess
mucus, huh? But what he's talking about, using it externally, though, correct? On this,
he was talking about both internally and externally.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just looking back through the book real quick to see if there was anything else. I don't
Like
know.
he was avoiding on like inflamed or already irritated areas.
Yeah. You know what I think he might have been talking about was like he's talking a lot about irritation in the gut, right? Because like cayenne is also an herb that promotes gastric secretions and is assisting in digestion for some
Okay.
folks. But if somebody already has a lot of inflammation in the gut, like, and the body is producing mucus as a form of protection from, you know, high acids or,
Okay.
yeah, I
That makes
wonder
sense.
if that's what he's talking about, like increasing that inflammation or that like heat that's already there that's producing mucus.
So you're adding to the heat, which you want to avoid at that point.
I think he was just kind of coming more from like it's caustic.
Okay. That makes sense. All right. Thank you.
All right. So here's that 1 part cayenne, 30 parts olive oil. All right, and then thinking about the spine, right? A lot of folks, when we're thinking about the musculoskeletal system, like the spine comes up a lot as, you know, a source of discomfort and pain. And mullein is really one of the premier herbs that I think of for that. And it's one that a lot of folks don't think of for the spine. It's maybe a little bit more of a esoteric or, you know, not as well documented use of the herb. It's mostly the root that's thought of for using for the spine. And especially thinking about when the spine has experienced some sort of trauma or some sort of misalignment. So thinking about, you know, a car accident or throwing your back out. This is an herb that often gets pointed to as, you know, as one to think about. So it's the roots harvested usually in the first year, the end of the first year, right? So the first fall or the spring of the second year before it starts to put up its flower stalk. The mullein's a biennial. It's going to flower in the second year and die. So we're going to try to harvest those roots in the fall or in the very early spring. And then that root is then tinctured in alcohol and taken in drop doses, you know, fairly large doses actually, I think like, you know, a dropper full or so several times a day. And then the leaves are actually used as well. There's a history of the leaves being used for helping with bone setting and bone alignment. So bones that have broken. Sanja Papam thinks of mullein as an herb that softens that which turns hard. So thinking of softening the muscles surrounding an out of place bone and for dislocation. He often will use this herb and recommend it for folks that are going to a chiropractor a lot. And he's on his website, he's shared ideas about stories of how he's shared it with his chiropractor friends who have used it in their practice and seen that when folks use this mullein root consistently, that the adjustments are easier and the adjustments hold longer in the body, in the spine, as compared to not using it. Mullein is used for relieving aches and pains and swollen joints. And it's useful in helping to build the synovial fluid, so those cushions for the joints. It promotes spinal alignment, and it heals and supports the tendons and ligaments. So while it really has an affinity for the spine, and like we see that in the shape, right? Like that really strong staff that comes up the second year. It is also a plant that kind of helps the synovial fluids and tendons and ligaments of the body in general. There was a really interesting story that I read once about a woman who didn't dig up the roots, but she looked at the structure of the plant and saw that, you know, the leaves go down the plant kind of like the vertebra, the spine. And so she kind of compared the structure of the spine, the different, you know, numbers that correspond with the spine, that we see here. And she chose leaves that were in a similar line on the mullein, and used that as a tincture and a poultice on that part of the spine that was hurting her, and experienced, great relief from that. I think it was Jim McDonald that shared that story, which I thought was so interesting. Does anybody have any experiences with mullein? I know a lot of people use this plant.
Hi, it's Thea. And I love this plant. It's probably the very first plant that ever grabbed my attention. And the alignment aspects of mullein are what I think are really, really interesting. I'm still experimenting, so I can't say that I know exactly how it works. So alignment on a lot of different levels, spinal alignment, emotional alignment, and that's the one that I can't really find a whole lot of other information about, but I feel it in myself. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, I'm very, very interested in experimenting with herbal smokes. So kind of got to the end of my ability to do research because I'm not finding a whole lot. But this is probably the only plant that you can smoke that actually heals the lungs. So when I was a really young woman, this is what I used to stop smoking tobacco when I realized how horrible it was for your lungs. So I was thinking about the lungs in terms of alignment. When my lungs are healthy, it's easier to sit up straight. So I just like blah, blah, blah all over the place, but I'm really interested in this plant. And Lacey, there's a thing I don't understand about it that I also wanted to ask you a question. It's the biennial nature of it. What does that really mean? Tell me about how it grows. Because I know how powerful the root is, but do I have to kill the plant to take the root? Is that what I have to do with it?
Yes, yeah. So the plant biennial, means that its first year is kind of its vegetative growth. The second year, it sends up the stalk and the flowers and its reproductive organ, right? And then it dies after that.
So that when I see all these on my path to a walk, I see all these mullein plants. Where are they coming? How are they propagating? How are they growing on the path?
By seed. The seeds, the seeds spread pretty far. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I had a really hard time last year when I realized what I had just gotten myself into, because I'm cultivating some things on my back porch. We have a whole lot of deer that eat things, and also a very, very steep backyard. So I'm having a great deal of fun cultivating things. And that's different also, that kind of growing. So it's a very different relationship as well. But when I realized I had to kill this plant, that was really hard for me. Is that, help me, Lacey?
Yeah. No, I can totally relate to that, Thea. When we do harvests for the CSA, I don't talk about it a whole lot with my interns or the CSA folks, but I usually have like a conversation with the plant as I'm harvesting them, especially when I'm harvesting the roots, very much of like, thanking it for its life and thanking it for creating space for the next generation and thanking it for its progeny. And, it's hard, especially like when we're taking it and it's in the fall of the first year that we're not even letting it get to its, full state, right? We're not letting it reproduce. But, that's, for me, at least, I try to create space, enough abundance of the plants that I can let some of them go to reproduction and some of them, harvest earlier.
Yeah, thank you. That's kind of what I decided about it, and absolutely what I did. And I left it because I realized when I got to it in the last spring, that I was not ready to deal with that. I was not ready to say, well, you're giving everything for me. So another thing that mullein does, And some people think this is about alignment. So one of the things, this isn't about bones, but one of the things that happens for women as we age is that everything about our bodies shifts, and the urinary tract really shifts a lot. And mullein is this kind of super healer for urinary tract issues, especially that first year root, not so much the leaves. And so as that's also apparently a matter of alignment. It helps with the actual alignment of the body and shifts the way all of the muscles are working there, which is really fascinating to me. But it's just, the reason I bring it up is that it's about relationship to plants for me. So thank you. That was really helpful, Lacey.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm writing that down. I didn't know that about urinary health.
Matthew Fox is where I found it, because I was not happy at all with the what I was reading, how much people don't like to talk about this, and staying really engaged in one's life is sort of the basis of what health is. And so that's really, really interesting to me, and that I had to develop a relationship with the plant to be able to say, thank you, you're giving your life for me to stay engaged with that. And I'm still working on it.
Yeah.
Lacey, I had a question.
Yeah.
If you waited till this stage to harvest the root, is the root just real shriveled up and dry because it's giving its nutrients to the flowering of the plant?
It's giant, but it's inert. So the first time I ever harvested mullein root, I didn't know that you had to do it when it was younger, right? And I think I was also in a state of denial of like, I'm not going to take it when it's younger. I'm going to let it spread its seed, and then I'll take it when it's done with its life.
Right.
And so I waited until it was, brown and shriveled basically, and dug it up and tinctured it. And it made this very dark tincture. But it wasn't until later that I read, and I hadn't used it yet. I read later that was not correct. And it, as I was chopping it and making it, and it was this very woody, very difficult to chop tincture, that I was making. It didn't feel right either.
Okay.
It didn't really feel like that was the living tissue that I should be tincturing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I've done the experiment with it. It doesn't do the same thing on my body, at least. I would never write about it because I haven't done enough work with it, but on my body it doesn't. And also it's a very, very beautiful natural dye plant.
Yeah.
So you could, that's how I experimented with, I wanted to see what the roots are. So if you take the roots, it'll give you kind of a brownish but stable dye. But if you take the whole plant, like the picture you have there, it gives this lovely green dye that's a little pastel-y, but very, very stable. I have some mullein that's 20 years old, the piece of fabric that's dyed with it. So it's very stable as well. So as I said, I love this plant.
Yeah. Very long relationship with this plant.
Yeah.
Lacey, what is the best way or anyone actually, it sounds like you're a professional mullein expert also, so whomever is ready to answer, but I wonder what you said, tincturing the root is the best preparation. Would you also tincture the leaves, or how would you best use the leaves?
Ready to connect.
Does anyone else want to answer?
I mean, I because I'm interested in the smoke quality, because in our culture, we think of smoking as mostly with alcohol, tobacco, and our tobacco plants are so mutated at this point. So this one is a plant, it's possible that this is true for other things, but this one is a plant that you still don't want to smoke a lot, because smoking in general is not great for your lungs, but it will heal the lungs. So because I use it like that, I dry the leaves pretty carefully. I pick them pretty carefully and dry them, and then use them in smoke. But I also drink them in tea in that way too.
Great, thank you so much. That's great.
Yeah, if you're gonna drink it in tea, just strain it really well, because it does have little hairs on the leaves.
Right.
Ready to connect.
right, can be uncomfortable to your throat.
It, absolutely. Yes. Thank you. That's true.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Lacey, I just have a question.
Yeah.
Talking about the roots, is that in general, if you're harvesting and your root is dry and shriveled, is it pretty much, do we want like, are we should avoid those kind of roots when we're harvesting? Is that a good indication that it's not going to be good?
I'd say generally, yeah. I'm trying to think of a root that doesn't apply to, but yeah, generally, like, so dandelion's a great example, right? Like, when the plant is going into the fall and winter, it's starting to send all of its energy down, and it's storing those, those sugars. And so when we harvest it in the late fall, like right before winter, we're kind of taking all of the parts of the plant that it was going to be using for its life cycle to go through the next year, right? But if we wait until summer to harvest the dandelion, it's already put all of its energy into creating its progeny, right? It's already created flowers and seeds, and it's already created leaves. So there's not a whole lot left there. And my experience in trying to dig them up later in the season is that they're very small and scraggly, and they look depleted.
Mhm.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. The last thing I want to say about mullein is that it's considered a salty remedy with mucilage. This is considered a moistening plant. And in that sense, that's another way that we can think of it as helping us to increase secretions and lubrications. And that saltiness usually points to minerals, right? We think about that with nettles too. Nettles has saltiness. And so this is a plant that we also think of as strengthening the mineral matrix of the body. All right. Thank you, mullein. Mugwort is one I wanted to touch on a little bit. Does anybody have experience with mugwort that would like to introduce us to mugwort?
I have my mute off, so I'll say this is another of my favorite plants. And although she grows in our backyard, I also am cultivating mugwort. And for me, so her name is Artemisia vulgaris, and different kinds of mugworts grow in different parts of the world. Like Artemisia absinthe will create something that is very, very strong. But Artemisia vulgaris, I'm very curious to know what she does about the bones and that part of the system. She's known as a dream weaver, and she can interact with us with the quality of our dreams. That's what I would say. And then there's a woman, I don't remember her name, but she actually really thinks that she's here to help us as a collective rework our dreams in the world. She grows everywhere. So I love this plant too. And she's Artemisia, she's named after the goddess Artemis, who is a moon goddess.
Julie, you mentioned mugwort. Do you have any thoughts about mugwort?
Yeah, I am lucky enough to have some of this beauty growing in my backyard. And I know, to kind of build off of the Artemis and the dreams, that she's also helpful for menstrual flow. And that's a time of the month where there's a lot of dreaming and a lot of lore associated with that as well. I know she's a bitter. And I will sometimes use her as this, like a smudging stick instead of using white sage, because I feel like white sage is problematic. So I'll use this, I'll bundle her up and use her as an incense. But I've also used it as a tea occasionally, menstrually. And I've made a hydrosol out of mugwort to use as a pillow mist, actually, for dream work as well. So I actually have a question for you about mugwort. My mugwort this year, her leaves have yellow in them and the sort of striations in them. Have you seen that, and what does that mean?
That doesn't sound familiar.
Yeah, it seems strange. I can maybe take a picture and send it to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I've seen that before. Yeah, if you can send me a picture, I'd love to see it.
Yeah, thanks.
Could it be some sort of nutrient deficiency in the soil?
Maybe. I don't know.
It was okay last year?
Yeah, last year it was just like the picture here, nice and bright and green. And this year, I'd say maybe 40% of the leaves are about 40% yellow.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
top, would you say it's more towards the top of the plant?
Maybe the top like 2/3 of the plant. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of the plants in our garden have experienced burning from the cold.
Oh,
We've
interesting.
had such late frost that they're not used to having to deal with cold this late into their growth cycle.
Yeah.
So it might be that they got kind of burned on top, like our garlic chives turned like, yellow and pink on top from the burning. So it might be that it got, too cold, and maybe if you give them a chop, and give them a little haircut, they'll put new growth on that won't have that issue.
Okay, great. So if I didn't cut that part off, it would continue to be a problem, or you just feel like in general the new growth won't have that issue?
I don't know that it would continue to be a problem, but it's kind of just like if a plant experiences damage, right, it's going to try to cut that part off.
Okay.
Right, so if you do it for it, then it doesn't have to put any energy into walling off that damage.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah. So like our lemon balm got crispy on top from the cold, and I went in and pretty much hacked back all the growth that had gotten toasty. That way it just doesn't have to put any energy into it.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. Thank you.
All right. So mugwort. Did anybody else want to talk about mugwort?
Just one more editing thing. It's Mugwort, in case somebody's going to look it up.
Whoopsie. Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, absolutely.
Mugwort.
I know you know that, but it's a lot. Like, this is the Zoom world where, oh yeah, that's what that says there.
I appreciate that. Yeah. My brain just like filled in the G even as I've been looking at it.
Yeah, me too, until I just looked back and I went, oh, it's mugwort. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Lacey.
Yeah. So I honestly don't have a ton to add on mugwort, but it is a plant that is considered high in minerals and nutrients, especially calcium. And so it's a plant that I think of for early season harvest for the calcium content, right? A lot of the dream quality that we think of, or even the qualities that are used in moxibustion, come later as the plant is experiencing more of its lifetime stresses and it's producing the secondary plant metabolites. When we harvest the mugwort when it's still really young and tender, we're getting mostly the primary plant metabolites, which is right like our basic carbohydrates and proteins, and then like some of our more basic minerals and vitamins, and not as much of the secondary plant metabolites. And even the smell is often not very pronounced yet in the plant. And I find that not until it's getting closer towards reproduction do I really start to get that what I consider full potency of smell. And so if I'm harvesting it for smudging or for smoking or something like that, like I would be harvesting it further into its life cycle. And at this point, when it's still young, I would be harvesting it for its mineral content. That's not to say that it won't have any effect on dream or that kind of thing. It still has, right, obviously like characteristics and spiritual aspects to it, but from a more chemistry perspective, it hasn't reached maturity yet. And so in that sense, I'm thinking of it nourishing the nervous system and also the connective tissues and joints. So yeah, thinking of it as kind of like a calcium supplement in the sense, especially when it's extracted into vinegar.
And that was my question, Lacey. Is that what you would do? Extract this for what you're talking about now, early?
Yeah, I would.
Into vinegar. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then probably like cook my greens with that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also we can touch on the fact that this is a plant that's used for moxibustion and used for the movement of qi in acupuncture and in traditional Chinese medicine. And so this is a plant that we can think of for helping with muscle movement and movement of stagnation when we have maybe more of those like stagnant qualities in the tissues. Jared Urchek, who's teaches with us on a lot of our mushroom classes, also is a 5 elements Chinese practitioner with acupuncture, and he talks about this being a warming plant, mugwort being a warming plant. So I think thinking of this plant for that damp stagnation and damp relaxation might be a really nice plant to think of. All right, and then considering the other systems that are at play, right? The nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the metabolic system. We've touched on all of these, right? And I think that there's plenty of thoughts that probably come to mind in this, but when we're thinking about formulation and thinking about how to combine different herbs, or even thinking about using 1 or 2 herbs to address a problem, also thinking about how those herbs work in different organ systems and in different body systems for the affinities you need. If you are experiencing musculoskeletal pain and you're also experiencing high stress at the same time, maybe you might turn to a plant like linden, which I didn't include in this PowerPoint, but linden is a plant that's often thought of for tendon and muscular health, but also is very much like a high potency nervine, cooling, nourishing nervine. And so that might be a plant that I might work with if I don't have a lot of plants on hand, or I want to keep my repertoire simple. Maybe I work with that for a little while and see if by affecting the nervous system, I also experience a relief in tension and pain that I'm experiencing. The cardiovascular system, right? Like thinking about how so much of the nourishment for our tissues comes from the ability for our cardiovascular system to deliver oxygen and nutrients and those synovial fluids to function correctly. So that's where we're thinking about, right? Those stimulants that we were talking about are really interesting to think about at this point. Yeah. And then the metabolic side, here's where I'm thinking about things like dandelion and all alternatives. Actually, I guess I do have a couple more. I do have a couple more. Just kidding. Dandelion. All right. Yes. So dandelion. So I'm thinking about dandelion in the sense of the metabolic side of this, right? So if we don't have great digestive function, if the digestive fires are not active, if we are bringing in great quality nutrients, but our body is just not doing a great job of getting those to the cells, or a lot of it is passing through and out as waste product, right? Especially in cases like fibromyalgia, where food and food sensitivities are so much a part of that experience. Definitely thinking about food medicines that are helpful in metabolic function. So dandelion is one that comes up again and again when it comes to the musculoskeletal system. It's a plant that's super high in minerals. The leaves in particular, I would think of putting in a vinegar for mineral extraction. The flowers are actually useful as well as an analgesic, and I think I have a slide on that in a little bit. Analgesic meaning that it helps us reduce pain. And then, yeah, thinking of the root as something to add to our diet or to a herbal concoction for helping us to assimilate nutrients better. Dark colored berries. All of what we're talking about, right, has so much to do with cellular health and like how the bones and the tissues are built. And I think that by adding these darker berries into our life, these anthocyanins and these polyphenols, we're really helping to protect the DNA of our cells, and we're helping to, like a plant like hawthorn in particular, kind of straddles that world where it's a plant that really we think of for cardiovascular health and helping us to have a strong cardiovascular system and heart, but also has all of those anthocyanins and polyphenols in it that are really beneficial to the cells in general. This is a dandelion, a magnesium lotion, and this is the heads of the dandelion that's being used. And I put this in here because dandelion heads, again, not one that I think a lot of people know about. There are some like analgesic or pain relieving effects to the latex that's found in the heads and the upper stems of the plant. It's also found in the roots, but the heads in particular seem to be used this way. And then the magnesium really for helping us to relax tension in the muscles. All right, so we'll do kind of a quick overview of actions and energetics to kind of wrap up the herbs, because we've talked about a lot of these, but just kind of to go over them again. So astringents are indicated for when there isn't tone, right? So when we have that lax, relaxed structure, when muscles are overstretched and overused. It is not indicated when there is cramping or tightness already. Herbs that we think of as astringents are horsetail, nettles, sage, oak, and willow. Horsetail and nettles really being the ones that have an affinity for the musculoskeletal system. The other three there are not necessarily specific to the musculoskeletal system, but can be used. Inflammation modulators, this is a different way of saying anti-inflammatory, but because herbs do not work the same way that anti-inflammatory pharmaceuticals work, it's useful, I think, to say inflammation modulator instead. Dampens down the inflammation, the body's healing state, which we typically consider a hot state. But note that we can have that damp heat, heat from cold, or heat from dryness. So each of these listed here kind of have their different ways of working. So meadowsweet, turmeric, willow, yarrow, and angelica are a couple of thoughts on inflammation modulators. Demulcents are indicated in dry and atrophy states, wasting of the tissues, stiffness, tension, lack of lubrication, moistness, or lack of lubrication and moistness, right? So this is like that vata state that Julie was talking about, this kind of like withered and dry state that needs some moistening. This is where we see our herbs like mullein and Solomon seal, okra, burdock that really brings the oils back to the body, licorice. Marshmallow falls into this category, but it's more attuned to the digestive and urinary system. So if this is, if the tissue states are being affected strongly by a dry or agitated digestive or urinary system, then that would be indicated in this. But if that's not really the case, then something like Solomon seal or mullein would probably be better suited. Alternatives indicated in stagnation, leaky gut syndrome, arthritic pain associated with food intolerance and liver stagnation. So then again, we have dandelion, nettles, and burdock are all considered alternatives. Nutritive tonics are mineral-rich plants that help work in tandem with an appropriate diet for your body. So things like sea kelp, bone broth, mushrooms, nettles, dandelion leaf, horsetail, alfalfa. Most of these here are considered salty in the flavor taste in Western herbalism, and salty again kind of indicating that it's helpful in the mineral matrix makeup of the body. Analgesic is pain relieving. This is a really broad category, and we'll talk about pain a little bit more when we talk about the nervous system. But here we have like willow and ginger, Jamaican dogwood, meadowsweet, dandelion flower, wild lettuce. But just to take those first two there, right, like willow, it's considered a cooling analgesic, and ginger is considered a warming analgesic. So, pain, kind of like what we were talking about with the cayenne, like pain relief is not just pain relief, right? There's like so many more factors to think of. So it's very different from when we take the Advil or any sort of non-steroidals as a way of treating pain, this is a lot more, we just have to think about it a lot more. Antispasmodics indicated in tissue state of tension, spasms, and wind. Some of these act on the muscles, some are more active on the nervous system. Cramp bark and lobelia are examples of ones that are really more muscle oriented. Cramp bark really in particular for smooth muscles. And then things like hops, valerian, and wild lettuce. This is kind of what I was talking about with the example with linden, right? Hops, valerian, and wild lettuce are pain relieving, are antispasmodic, but really have more of an action on the nervous system. So we're coming at it from kind of a different entry point. And then we have circulatory stimulants. This is indicated when we have cold, damp tissues, and the conditions are also generally, we might be thinking of these also as a digestive stimulant. So there's maybe that digestive component there, which is the opposite of what we're experiencing if we think of marshmallow. This would be when we have stagnation and too much dampness in our digestive system, not enough fire, not enough acid production. So we would turn to something like cayenne or rosemary or ginger maybe. And then this was from the Herbal Academy. I just pulled this from their website as an example of some of the herbs that we've talked about in one formula, right? So they've used Solomon seal, horsetail, and mullein in high proof alcohol. And they're, telling folks to take 15 to 30 drops of that as needed 1 to 4 times a day. And then that you can also use this tincture straight on the skin. So that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about the musculoskeletal system is that unlike some of the other systems, I guess not unlike the other systems, but this one in particular, I think of really so many of the applications can go internally and externally from the same bottle, which I think is really interesting, especially if we're using alcohol that can be used internally. It's also possible to use it externally, and I think that's good to remember. All right, and then I just wanted to share this from Paul Bergner. Again, we'll talk about pain more in another class, but this was just another way of kind of thinking about how pain is complicated and the ways that pain affects us and the where pain comes from is different in different conditions. So thinking about all the different ways that we can address pain, not just by addressing the actual sensation of pain. All right, and then we're gonna do a really quick demonstration of vinegar infusions. So I just need maybe like a couple minutes to like take my computer downstairs so I can show you a vinegar infusion. Let me take this off because I would like to see any of the faces that are present. Yes, a couple faces, great. I'm really hoping that next month we can be in person. It kind of depends, right, on like what's happening in the world, but if it's possible, I was thinking maybe we even move to Foxhaven and come to the barn at Foxhaven, where we'd have a lot of space to stretch out. We can keep the doors open so there's some airflow. We're not contained in a small space. So that's kind of my hope, is that if next month feels safe for everybody and it's considered possible, that maybe we'll be in person next month, and then we could blend our bitters and make our vinegar infusion next time. So I would build in maybe more time for us to have some hands-on time and build in lots of tables so that we could spread out while we're doing that. Does anybody have any like gut reactions to that suggestion? Just kind of to see where we're at.
I really like that idea with the more space.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like meeting at Foxhaven. I think that would be nice.
Okay. If y'all have more thoughts about that and want to email me, please do. I don't want to jump the gun on doing that if folks feel like it's unsafe or they don't feel comfortable. But I also feel like we've had so many, opportunities to meet through Zoom that I very much miss our hands-on time and would like to try to design ways to do that are safe for us and that everybody feels comfortable with. Especially since we're not a huge group. We're still kind of a small group. So think we could try to make that work. All right. All right, so I'm gonna turn my, I'm gonna mute myself and take us downstairs so I can just set up on the table and do a vinegar extraction, and we can kind of chat about any lingering questions during that time.
Julie, I had a question for you. Oh, she's gone.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm here. Yes, what's up?
you mentioned a book way back at the beginning by Dr.
Lad, L-A-D. I don't know if you can see his name there.
Okay, yeah. I almost got his last name right.
Yeah, it's just L-A-D.
Yeah, I had L-A-H-D, so.
This book is pretty clinical. It's the first book of a series.
Yeah.
You can definitely read it, but it's one that I like to pick through very slowly. For Ayurveda in general, the author I always recommend is David Frawley, F-R-A-W-L-E-Y.
Right.
And literally anything you pick by him is going to follow the same basic format of explaining the 8 limbs of yoga and the doshas of Ayurveda and the elements. And he just does the same content from a different lens, from a different angle. So it's always the same structure, which is really nice. It's a nice touchstone.
So he would be Western, coming from the West, friendly type book.
He is, the Indian authors call him an Indian in a white man's body. So he's, he is a Westerner, but he's very Vedic in the way he thinks. He's very Eastern in the way he thinks. If you want a Westerner, I would go with Dr. John Douillard. His website is lifespa.com, lifespa.com. And it looks, to me, it looks a little hokey. It looks a little Dr. Oz, but he is legit. He did get his Doctor of Ayurveda in India, and he knows what he's talking about. And he's really passionate about proving Ayurveda through Western trials. And so he's always talking about the newest research. And that, so he's definitely a bridge between those cultures.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, I don't want to give him something that's just way over my head, So.
I totally understand. There's so much to it. And it's really nice if you can study with someone. If you can ever, get to Kripalu, or if you're local to Frederick, I know the yoga studio Soul Yoga often has really world-class Ayurvedic lecturers that come there pretty regularly. So Soul Yoga is a great place to look for Ayurveda teachers.
Okay.
And a lot of the Kripalu ones come down to Seoul, actually. So.
All right, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, best of luck on your journey. So, a journey of many lifetimes.
I know.
Yeah.
One thing I don't find confusing, but just starting herbal studies, you're starting off with the Western concepts, but then you have traditional Chinese and then Ayurvedic.
Yeah.
And then for me, it's, I don't see how I could combine all different kinds because I'll just get so confused. So it seems I have to choose one thing that sort of fits for me and follow that.
I think that's definitely fair. What I've experienced is that whatever knowledge I have really lived with and tried on myself and, studied for more than a year, that stuff gets integrated into me, it gets digested into me, and then it just comes out authentically. And so no matter what background it's from, if it's something that I've really spent the time on integrating, then I don't have to stop and think and reference, so that's it. Unfortunately, it takes a long time, but that's the best advice I could give, is just work, experiment in your own body and in your own observation of the world, one thing at a time. So yeah, slow and steady. You're welcome. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. So I just have some cleavers here that I got out of the yard. It's the end of cleaver season. So everybody worked with cleavers, probably. Yeah, so this is cleavers. It sticks to you. And for folks that like to do like wild foraging, you'd want to harvest this plant when it's really young for culinary purposes, like before it kind of gets real sticky. But to harvest it for its kind of lymphatic action and its mineral content for vinegar, you'd wait until it's flowering like this. Yeah, so it's like, it's still green, it's still lush. It hasn't yellowed. This one was, you know, I've seen a lot of different patches around here at Foxhaven, and some of them are like yellow and purple now because they're in the sun. But if they're still lush green like this, then it's fine. It doesn't matter like a specific time of year necessarily, but they'll come out in the spring and then again in the fall. These are self-seeding annuals, so they'll come out twice, just like chickweed. So I'm just gonna chop it up. I've been doing a lot of cleavers, mostly just because it's cleaver season, right? But I really like to do them as cold extractions, cold teas. But especially since I kind of damaged my wrist, I've been kind of spending a little extra time with cleavers because of their action in the lymphatic system. And for the doctrine of signatures with cleavers, now they're all like, you know, it doesn't, once you put it in a bundle, it looks like terrible, but the doctrine of signatures with cleavers is that it's got these stems and then a whorl of leaves, and then these stem and then a whorl of leaves, right? And it's kind of reminiscent of the way the lymphatic system works, where the lymphatic system has these little one-way valves in it, right, that prevent lymphatic tissues and liquids from going backwards, right? So it's kind of constantly kind of pushing it through these little valves, and, you know, using our bodies, our muscles, you know, manipulation and movement to gently move that lymphatic system, you know, through the channels. So that is one of the doctrine of signatures that folks have pointed out about the cleavers. All right, so then I'm just gonna, once I have it chopped up pretty well, I'm just gonna stick it in a jar. It is a very like unscientific way of making vinegar extractions. And I am heating some vinegar on the stove. I'm using raw apple cider vinegar. I also really like to use white wine vinegar and rice vinegar. What kind of vinegar do you guys like to use for vinegar extractions? Does anybody make vinegar extractions at home?
Yes, I do. Raw apple cider vinegar mostly is what I stick with.
Yeah. How do you like to use yours, Thea?
So I first started working with vinegar, the first CSA with fire ciders, Rosemary Gladstar idea. But then I realized how really delicious all of these vinegars are. So sometimes I use it for cooking is more than anything. And then I can't really get my family to eat most of this stuff, and the vinegar infusion is just so nutritious in some ways. So I've been making a really delicious vinaigrette with it, and so they're getting, I put up a lot of fire cider at the end of the season, and so they're getting fire cider in a delicious vinaigrette plus salad. Seems, yeah, kind of good idea, but mostly that's what I'm using. Yeah.
I did that all winter too, the fire cider salad dressing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's delicious and it's really good for you too. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I will often put vinegar at the bottom of my teapot, you know, just like a little bit of vinegar. And if I've made an oxymel, maybe a little bit of oxymel in the bottom of my teapot, and then, you know, put my herbs in their little container and pour the hot water over it. I think I'm just really drawn to like that sour, tangy flavor. And so I really like it in things like tea. And then, yeah, I'll use it in place of citrus for brightening dishes. Like I'll, dress some rice with it, or it's actually helpful in keeping beans from falling apart. I cook a lot of beans at home. And there's a substance in beans that acts like a glue and holds them together that gets broken down pretty easily in water. But if you put a little bit of vinegar in when you're cooking it, it holds the beans together and keeps their shape. So if you think of like baked beans, right, like a big pot of baked beans with that heavy vinegar in it, like you can cook those baked beans forever and they seem to hold their shape. So there's some like culinary uses that I like to use it for. And then if I'm trying to be super fancy, I'll put it in sparkling water and have it as like a spritzer. But those are my favorite ways to use vinegar. Yeah. So this one, the cleavers, is such like a light flavor. So it's one that I feel like I can blend into a lot of things, even for my family members that don't prefer strong flavors. This is one that I can usually blend into lots of different things. So I heated it up, just till it was starting to like steam a little bit. All right. And then I'll just put the top on. I'll get it a little bit higher and put the top on. And I'm using a plastic lid. You could use cork, or you could use, anything that's not corrodable. And if you're going to use a metal one, just put some wax paper under there. I wanted to show you the vinegar that I made with nettles. So this is like the vinegar that I started with, right? Is this like apple cider vinegar. And I just put like, fresh nettles in it and let it sit for a couple weeks. And like, it's like black. Like, look at how dark it is. It's
Wow.
dark. Yeah.
Crazy.
I really packed it in there. But I didn't expect it to get this dark. I've made it in the past and have never had it get this dark. But yeah, I don't know what happened with this one in particular, but this one's like chock full of the chlorophyll. Go ahead, Jade.
I made tea with my nettles, and it also turned very, very, very dark the next day.
I can't hear you, Jade.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's.
Ready to connect.
So sorry. Okay, I had you on my Bluetooth. I forgot. I made tea with my nettles, and it also turned very black. And I didn't know if I left it there because I was like, I don't know if if I was still supposed to drink it. I knew it was the chlorophyll, but I was not sure if it had oxidized too much that I should still be drinking it, or.
Yeah, no, sometimes they turn super black. Like sometimes they're not as dark, but
Yeah.
frequent for me at least, if I let them sit long enough that they get pretty dark.
Yeah. Also, do you always heat your vinegar before an infusion?
I don't always heat it, no, but I have gotten into the practice of heating it recently. I feel like it speeds up the cell walls kind of being able to release and break down, just like when you make tea, right? So I have gotten into the practice of heating it a little bit, and also kind of like the practice of making quick pickles or vinegar, like vinegar pickles. You often heat the vinegar, right? So it's a way of kind of like, but I don't heat it very high, but I do heat it now a good bit, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah. I used to just like put things in a jar and pour vinegar over it and like let it sit for like ever. And I've started to kind of get out of that process with vinegar in particular. Like tinctures, I'll still do that. But I feel like vinegar doesn't have quite the same shelf life, right, that tincture does. And I feel like it's preferential for me to speed up the extraction a little bit and then strain it out. So yeah, I'm never bringing it to a boil. I'm not heating it very high, but I do warm it basically before I put it in.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Yeah. And then like Rosemary Gladstar says that, the shelf life of infused vinegar is like 6 months to a year. I've certainly had ones that lasted a bit longer than that, but it's all really based on taste and smell, right? Like if it starts to smell or taste off, then you know. All right, folks. Any other thoughts or questions? Closing ideas?
I just wanted to give a shout out about the Fox Haven Herbalist vodka at McClintock. I just ordered something from there, and you guys get 10%, and it's 100 proof alcohol, and I'm really happy, whatever the collaboration was, to be able to do that, because it's always hard to find organic vodka to make your tinctures out of, and that's really important to me. So thank you for whatever collaboration. I already said thank you to them.
Yeah.
And I'm recommending it. I'm recommending it to everyone if you're making tinctures. It's local, it's organic, it's just so cool. Yeah, and it helps Fox Haven. And I'm not getting a kickback from that, just so you know. I just want to say, really, really, really good job. I'm glad that they're doing it.
Yeah, I'm glad too. It really just came out of me telling people to go there and ask them for the cane alcohol out of bond, like to take a bottle and like have them fill it out before they did their other stuff. And the comptroller of Maryland found out that was happening and was like, oh, no, you cannot do that. So McClintock came to us and they were like, actually, we have a lot of people that come to us for that. Like, you've sent a lot of people to us over the years. Like, we'd like to make something for you. And like, thank you for that, basically sending people to them. So they wanted to make this specifically for herbalists. Which is super cool.
It's just a really wonderful collaboration that lightens my heart during these days. So thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. I think next month, I believe, is reproductive system with a guest teacher, and she's going to be talking about steams and the reproductive health. I'll make sure that that's the case. I'm pretty sure that's the case, but hopefully we'll be in the barn, and I'll set aside some time that we can also do some of our preparations that we haven't been able to do in person, that we can catch up on those. Anything else, anybody? All right. Well, thank you so much, Julie, for being with us.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah, it was really great to learn from you.
Thank you.
Yes, it was.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thank you, Lacey. Thank you all.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you,
Thank
ladies.
you, Nancy.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
I'll send out the recording afterwards, and we'll see y'all next month.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye-bye.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you.